Chapter 438. The reason why Su Lo lived so bitterly and persistently was very simple. It was because he wanted to live. He wanted to widen his small eyes and see all the injustices in this world, so that it would be convenient for him to dig up and kick at any time. And the reason why the youthful and violent Lieutenant Colonel Li Feng lived so bitterly was not only because of his own so-called ideals, but more so because he had to maintain the glory of his family. He was the only son of the Lees of Philadelphia. When he came to the military camp at a young age, his life on the battlefield was already fixed within a certain range. He could die, but he could not lose, and he could not escape. The powerful pulse current was like countless small knives scraping at his periosteum and teasing his muscle fibers. The soreness, pain, and bitterness reached a terrifying level. However, this kind of extreme physiological stimulation allowed him to more clearly grasp the traces of the mysterious power in his body, and also allowed his brain to become clearer. Li Feng sat by the bed in silence, numb. His body trembled violently. Blood seeped out from the corners of his thin lips. That pair of eyes that were usually full of violence had a few drops of tears. After all, it was still painful. After all, he was not a real steel body. After all, he was only a young man who had not yet reached 18 years of age. However, the pain and weakness would always be in his own private quarters, in the darkness. When the time was up, the pulse current equipment in the press box automatically shut down. The young lieutenant colonel took a deep breath and wiped away the slight wetness at the corner of his eyes. An expression of self-loathing appeared on his face. The strongest young pilot in the Federation knew very well that he had absolute talent in mecha piloting. However, it was a pity that he did not completely inherit his grandfather's ability in cultivation. He stared blankly at his thick and strong arms, looking at the strong muscles under the copper skin. He thought to himself that the abnormal ability of his family in cultivation seemed to be getting weaker and weaker as his bloodline faded. In fact, his father, Director Li Jiedu, did not feel anything in this aspect at all. That mysterious power was the true reason why the god of war Li Pifu had never lost a battle. It was also the reason why the Lees of Philadelphia were proud of the world and looked coldly at the 7 great families. If all the soldiers of the Federation could learn this ability, then what were the people of the Empire? However, Li Feng knew very well that this was impossible. If he had not been stimulated by the electric current since he was a child, perhaps he would not have been able to find the burning power in the deepest part of the human body like his grandfather. He vaguely knew that there were some truly powerful pilots in the Empire's royal family who also possessed some extremely powerful abilities. However, there were very few of them, and they were of noble status. They had to stay on Tianjing planet to protect the royal family. Therefore, as the strongest warrior in the Federation, he did not have the chance to see them. Thinking of this, Li Feng's eyes burst out with a trace of light. His lips were tightly pursed, and the air around his body condensed, giving birth to a strong fighting spirit. Those true experts of the Empire, the princess of the Empire who was rumored to be as talented as him, who had reached level 6 at such a young age. Could she stand a chance? The air defense alarm in the Chulin base sounded. He looked out of the window, and the light in his eyes gradually faded, turning into some kind of doubt. At this moment, he thought of a person. He had to pay such a huge price to learn the secret martial arts passed down in his family. His uncle. How did he manage to teach that guy? Thinking of Su Lo, Li Feng's emotions became somewhat complicated. He stood up and began to tidy up his military uniform. He was silent, but in his heart, he was a little envious of that guy's story all these years. That guy was not a professional soldier, so he could do whatever he wanted. This freedom to do whatever he wanted was so enviable. Up to this point, Li Feng had long wanted to kill Su Lo, not because he called him uncle, not because of the legendary uncle, and not because of the relationship between Auntie Mu Zi and Su Lo. It was because of a feeling called hypocrisy. After all, in the universe of the Federation, only the two of them had certain abilities and secrets. However, Li Feng thought of the words his grandfather had said in Qingqing prison. He couldn't help but frown and shake his head. Dragging the suitcase, he pushed open the door and walked toward the black mecha painted with golden stars. While Madman Li was being tortured and then thinking and preparing for war with doubts, Su Lo was also thinking and preparing for war with doubts and then being tortured. He stared at the hundreds of soldiers scattered around the military camp. Those two thick, knife-like eyebrows of his finally couldn't help but furrow. He didn't understand why the Department of Defense would throw this dog shit in his face. He also didn't know if this was the arrangement of his convenient father-in-law, Minister Zhou, or the old man's sudden idea. The existence of him and the 20 men of Team 7 at the front line was somewhat strange. Nominally, they were mercenaries under Nutshell Company, but Su Lu, the leader, was an active-duty lieutenant colonel of the General Assembly Base. Even the West Woods Military District couldn't give them orders. They directly received orders from the Department of Defense of the Federation. However, this latest order from the Department of Defense was really a bit of a mess. 3 days later, Su Lu would lead his team into Fallen Planet 163 to complete a complicated and dangerous battlefield mapping mission for the Federal Forces. For Team 7, who specialized in special operations, and Su Lu, who carried the hopes of several big shots in the federal military, they were already mentally prepared for the danger of the new mission. However, they didn't expect that in such a tense time for war, the Department of Defense would throw hundreds of pieces of dog shit in front of them and ask them to take this pile of dog shit with them on the road. How to go on the road? Go on the road peacefully and send these guys to their deaths one by one. Not only did Su Le think this way, but the always quiet Bai Yulan, the outspoken Xiong Linquan, and all the men of Team 7 also thought this way. He and Team 7 were still in the Sunset State on the main planet of the West Woods, but they had already moved out of the Golden Star Hotel and arrived at a military camp in the mountains. Symbolically. Here. Sheeping. Here. Besides Su Lu, Bai Yulan was softly calling out names. In front of them, more than 100 soldiers answered weakly. These soldiers didn't know how to sit properly or stand properly. Some of them were so fat that they could crush mechas if they gained a little weight, and some of them were so fat that they could be blown into space by the wind of the planet if they lost a little weight. Some of them were delinquents with pale faces, and some of them were unscrupulous uncles who had been in the army for many years. These soldiers were active soldiers from the 83-84 unit of the garrison district of the capital planet. The Department of Defense arranged for them to come to the West Woods to support Team 7 as peripheral combat personnel. However, when they saw the lazy and rascally appearance of these guys, Su Lu and the men of Team 7 couldn't help but wonder, were these people here for a vacation or what they were here for? The 83-84 unit was a unit with a glorious tradition. Its predecessor was the 17th Armored Division that was single-handedly created by the god of war Li Pifu. Ever since the god of war retired, the Federation moved the 17th Division back to the capital planet in order to ensure the continuity of this glorious division. They placed the 17th Division on the banks of the largest city in the Federation, Harbor City. It was originally with good intentions, but unexpectedly, after more than 10 years, the bustling night scene of Harbor City eroded their bones and stole their souls. This Iron Division was worn down until only the name of the past was left, and today's pink and dull bodies were left. In fact, the men of Team 7 were all from the 17th Division, but they had been transferred to the Whitewater Company a long time ago. Now, they had become the trump cards of their respective units. They looked at these juniors in shock and couldn't help but feel a little scared. If they had stayed in Harbor City all these years, would they have become the same kind of shit? After the roll call ended, Su Lu stood at the front without saying a word. He silently looked at these new recruits that belonged to him. Most of the soldiers leaned limply on their chairs. They didn't care about the so-called military discipline, and they didn't even put him, the highest-ranking officer, in their eyes. Some of them had even started smoking. And behind the crowd, there were a few fierce-looking soldiers staring at him coldly. Their eyes were filled with cold arrogance. Sulu looked at these people silently. He didn't reprimand them. He lowered his military cap, adjusted the sunglasses on his nose, and said to Lan Xiaolong, who was behind him. I remember when we were at the training base, you said that the old man really hoped that I would lead the 17th Division back to its former glory. But I never would have thought that the old man's unit would become like this. Just a long trip on a warship and they're so tired that they're paralyzed like dogs. I'm not a professional soldier, but I know that this kind of unit can't be considered to have any combat power. How do you think I can lead them? Also, is there something wrong with the heads of the Department of Defense? Training these guys on the battlefield will only kill them. How can they be turned into steel? Can I not accept this? Major Lan Xiaolong, who was usually sharp-tongued, was especially silent today. This was because he was the only active duty officer of the 83-84 Division in Group 7. Looking at these old soldiers smoking, chatting, cursing, and even picking their feet, he felt very embarrassed. He smiled bitterly. It should be known that Sulu had always been very good at controlling his emotions. But today, he was so angry that he said such a long paragraph. This was very telling. Bai Yulan put away the electronic notebook and looked at the soldiers in front of him. Even he couldn't help but say coldly, how did the division become like this? He was also a member of the 17th Division. Lan Xiaolong shrugged and sighed. Although the garrison officers are very happy to be in Port City every day, their combat power and discipline shouldn't be so bad. According to my understanding, the people sent by the Department of Defense this time are also the best of the 83-84 Division. He took Bai Yulan's electronic notebook and pointed at it softly beside Su Lu. Especially these guys, including Zhong Xiang and Shi Ping, whom Yulan just mentioned, and a few others. As he spoke, Lan Xiaolong pointed at the soldiers in the barracks. The soldiers he pointed at had cold, arrogant, and provocative expressions. There was also a hint of anxiety and anger, as if they didn't care at all about what he was saying to the lieutenant colonel wearing sunglasses. What do you mean? Su Lu asked. Zhong Xiang, the son of the principal of Yue University. Shi Peng, the nephew of the deputy speaker of Xi'an. Lan Xiaolong replied seriously, among these 100 people, there is a son of a governor, 5 sons of state senators, and 2 sons of Federation senators. I have to remind you, this is very difficult to deal with. Su Lu was stunned. He didn't expect that the young man who was smoking and cursing was the son of the old principal. He also didn't expect that the curly-haired young man who was sprawled out on the chair like a hooligan and looking at him with provocative eyes was the nephew of the deputy speaker of Xi'an. After a moment of silence, he looked at this group of real young masters with great backgrounds and asked, "Is this the legendary old master soldier?" Chapter 439. The weather in the West Woods was a little gloomy today. The air pressure in the camp and Su Li's voice were a little gloomy. Lan Xiaolong lowered his head slightly and laughed bitterly, tacitly agreeing to this unpleasant name. Behind the lazy old soldiers, there were 7 or 8 fellows with clearly different temperaments. These people were clearly not beaten down by the fatigue of the long journey, and were currently displaying their skills on the training equipment, as well as the exaggerated bulging muscles of every part of their bodies. These people played with the heavy training equipment vigorously as they coldly stared at Su Lu and the members of Team 7 in front of the crowd. Although their nostrils were not blowing white smoke into the air, their unruly and slightly provocative gazes were enough to show that these strong soldiers were howling in the depths of their hearts, preparing to do something to pass the time. Looking over there through his sunglasses, Sulu narrowed his eyes and asked, "Then where are these guys from? Are they bodybuilders from the Ministry of National Defense?" "They are also from our 17th Division." Lon Xiaolong shrugged and said, "The sons of the big shots love to enter the 17th Division, but after all, this is the division that the old man single-handedly brought up, so the Ministry of National Defense still picked out a few elites and stuffed them in." "It's 8,384. Bai Yulan softly interjected from the side. It was obvious that this delicate but deeply incisive man was absolutely unwilling to admit that these old soldiers or those muscle-bound idiots in front of him were the juniors of his division. Lon Xiaolong ignored him and looked at Su Lu and said, "These guys are specially used to represent the division in the various assessments of the Ministry of National Defense. Now, the 17th Division is relying on these people to make a name for themselves. Plus, no one is controlling them, so these guys are a little arrogant and irritable. Yes, they know me, otherwise they would have already made a scene by now. If they were not old soldiers with great backgrounds, then they were undisciplined soldiers." Su Lu suddenly felt that his eyebrows were a little itchy. He reached out his right index finger and lightly scratched it. Looking around the camp, to everyone's surprise, he turned and walked back to his room without saying a word. The 100 or so soldiers from the 17th Division couldn't help but feel a little surprised when they saw the lieutenant colonel, who was obviously their highest-ranking officer, turn around and leave just like that. There wasn't a storm of reprimanding as they had expected. Song Xiang, who was slumped in his chair, had long prepared himself to be scolded by his superior and then take advantage of the situation to cause trouble. Who would have thought that all his psychological preparations would hit a wall of silence? Instead, he felt a little uncomfortable from being stifled, and his slumped posture became a little stiff. Other than the 4 major military academies in the Federation, Yue University had the deepest relationship with the military. It was the only school that had the right to conduct mecha education. As the only son of a principal, he had been given preferential treatment ever since he joined the military. Otherwise, he would not have dared to act like this, not giving his superior any face. "What the hell is going on? All I know is that we are on the front line in the West Woods, but why are we here? What kind of troop was this? When can we go back?" he asked his companion Shiping angrily. Shiping was the nephew of the vice-chairman of the Federation Management Committee. And logically speaking, any secret transfer by the Ministry of Defense should not have escaped his eyes. However, at this moment, this young master's face was also filled with confusion and resentment. This batch of 100 or so old soldiers were actually feeling abnormally depressed, angry, and confused at this moment. Otherwise, they would not have purposely acted in such a disrespectful manner when their superior called them out. Because they had no idea why the Ministry of Defense would send soldiers like them from the garrison district to the terrifying and bloody front line. About half a month ago, these soldiers of Unit 8384, who had been living a life of drunkenness in the outskirts of the port city, were suddenly urgently transferred to the military spaceport by their superiors. At the same time, all of their communication devices were confiscated. Then, they inexplicably boarded a warship, and after more than 10 days of dizzying high-speed space travel, they arrived in the West Woods in a daze. "I want to go back." Shiping gritted his teeth and said fiercely, "When I find a phone, I'll call Uncle immediately. Is the Ministry of Defense crazy? Sending us to the front line, don't they know that people will die here?" In the past tens of thousands of years, the status of the military in the Federation society had never been high, because the Federation did not have any powerful enemies in the universe. At that time, the political structure of the society, other than the Supreme Court of the Federation, was mainly the checks and balances of the Federation government, the Management Committee, and the 7 families hidden in the shadows of history. However, with the appearance of the Empire's invaders, after countless crushing defeats, tragic victories, and life-and-death situations, the status of the federal military was blown by the wind and skyrocketed in the short span of 60 years. Whether it was the lofty image in the hearts of the hundreds of millions of people in the Federation, or the needs of survival in reality and political needs, it all made the military the most special and important part of the Federation society. The Federal Army expanded greatly, its status rose, and its power increased. According to the Constitution, the president who commanded the Federal Army naturally became more powerful together with his government. In comparison, the Federation Management Committee and those families without military power gradually lost their shine. Under such a background and climate, the Federation formed an atmosphere of pride in the military. Whether it was the politicians or the economic tycoons, they all did everything they could to establish a relationship with the military. Even one of the 7 families, the Iron Calculator family, had been working hard in this regard, not to mention other people. However, the big shots in the upper class of the Federation were not really willing to let their families and their children bleed and sacrifice for the survival of the Federation. What they needed was to go to the military camp and leave a beautiful page in their resume files. The 83-84 unit stationed in the suburbs of the port city, this security force, that had been created by the god of war but had never been to the front line again, had undoubtedly become the first choice of these big shots. As a result, the invincible 17th Armored Division in the past had become a shady army filled with the mediocre and lazy aura of the rich and powerful. Through Lan Xiaolong's introduction in a low tone, Su Lu roughly understood some of the historical background, but he still did not understand the real intention of the Department of Defense's arrangement. He knew that he was not a suitable role to lead an army. It was not difficult for him to single-handedly kill 7 people. This kind of courage and boldness was not difficult for him, but to turn a pile of dog shit into flowers was completely inconsistent with his personality. However, from the experience of the past year, it seemed that the old man in Philadelphia was determined to watch him fail. He had to make up his mind to bring these guys from Group 7 out. On the one hand, it was because he could not be like the uncle who took in these guys and ignored their future. The more important reason was that although Group 7 had never had a chance to show their real combat power on the battlefield, after a long time of getting along with them, Su Lu had seen their training and knew their professionalism, discipline, and the sense of honor of real soldiers. As for those old soldiers, he sat alone in the room, turned on the workbench, and found that there was a reply from Shang Qiu in the military encrypted mailbox. He wasn't in a hurry to reply, because in the past half-year, he had often communicated with Miss Shang Qiu about mechanical repair. He lightly tapped on the touch keyboard and began to write a letter to Zhou Yu, who was far away in Linhai province. Half an hour later, the beep that represented a reply sounded that in the past 2 years, whenever there was a need for political analysis or calculation, Su Lu always habitually thought of this beautiful girl who liked to wear bright red. This habit began in the Wangdu apartment and had not changed since then. This was because Su Lu knew very well that his genius brain was more suited for machine language and was not good at the complicated politics between humans. His friend Tai Ziyuan definitely had an absolutely trustworthy mind, but he did not want this to be mixed in with their friendship. The most important thing was that this prince often went missing. Zhou Yu's reply was very quick. This young mother very calmly used very simple words to analyze the situation Su Lu was facing and the real reason why the Department of Defense used him as a knife. The war between the Federation and the Empire had begun. Other than the shock and excitement of the Federation, there were still inevitably anti-war cries. This was especially so for a group of George Carlin supporters who had split off from the Medellin Youth Army. Through some unknown means, they had obtained the personnel list of certain military logistics units and published it through the Capital Special District Daily. The people of the Federation were shocked and angry to find that these logistics units that did not need to go to the front lines were actually filled with the descendants of Federation politicians and rich people. In the email, Zhou used a very sarcastic tone to mock the big shots of the Federation. She did not even spare her own father, because the current Federation Minister of Defense was actually the real head of logistics for the Federation in recent years. Under the full suppression of the Federation government and the upper echelons of society, this news was suppressed. However, President Pobre ordered the Department of Defense to conduct a sample investigation. He angrily instructed that they must find out whether the danger level of the Federal Army was inversely proportional to its wealth. Perhaps it was because of this background, or because the old man in Philadelphia could not bear to see the current state of the 17th Division anymore. That was why there was this space trip that frightened and angered the young masters, and that was why there was this scene in the West Woods military camp today. The soldiers of the common people were sacrificing their lives on the front lines in the West Woods, while the young masters of these big shots were hiding in the suburbs of Harbor City, leading a drunken life. After reading this email, Su Li's narrowed eyes did not become cold, but instead calmed down. He had long known that the Federation had collapsed to a certain extent, but he did not expect that some of the big shots would try to use him as a knife to cut the rotten meat. In his silence, he did not notice that Zhou had used an angry emoticon at the end of the email to ask the hooligan to stop harassing her. Su Li walked out of the room and came to the military camp under the gloomy sky. Looking at the old soldiers who looked like mud, he put on his sunglasses and said, "Assemble." There was no scene of no one listening to him, because this was a military camp after all, and he was the highest military officer here. It was just that the speed of assembly was a little slow, and those young masters who came to the military camp for gilding seemed to be suffering from cartilage. Su Li looked at the more than 100 soldiers in front of him and clearly saw the so-called sense of superiority and fearlessness on many of their faces. Chapter 440. Su Li looked at the people in front of him through his sunglasses. His expression was calm and composed. Compared to these young masters of the upper class, he was just an orphan from Donglin. He was born poor, and it was impossible for him to have a golden spoon or precious jade in his mouth when he was born. However, he had great strength and a strong backbone. In his mind, he had always been entangled with the oldest and greatest old man in human society. Even when facing the revered god of war, Li Pifu, he could still stiffen his neck and remain composed, showing a sense of superiority in front of him. That was a joke. After a moment of silence, he opened his mouth and said to the people in front of him, "Perhaps many of you are still wondering why the Department of Defense sent you to the West Woods. In fact, I am also very puzzled by this question. Because I don't know where to start training you. You are just a pile of dirt. Even if you are smelted in a high-temperature furnace for a few years, you will only become brittle and useless ceramic pieces. It is impossible for you to become the steel material that the army truly needs. The material you are made of determines your possibilities. If you are a pile of dog shit and pee your pants after going to the front line because of the Empire's roaring bullets, then you will become a pile of diluted shit. If you stick to the pants of our Group 7, it will make me very uncomfortable and very angry." In the S1 training base, Su Li, who wore sunglasses, had already played the role of a cold instructor many times. He was already very familiar with this set of actions. Those truly outstanding people of the Federal Army had all turned red under his harsh humiliation. They were angry and irritable. Not to mention this group of old soldiers from the 17th Division in front of him, this group of young masters who had never been humiliated like this in their lives. Dog shit was still diluted. Dirt could not be smelted into steel. The soldiers listened to these extremely humiliating words and looked at the taunting and bullying of the lieutenant colonel at the front of the line, whose face was mostly covered by sunglasses. Their expressions had already become extremely ugly. Many people showed resentment in their eyes. Some people began to discuss with gloomy expressions. Su Li ignored these obvious violations of discipline. He looked down at the list in the electronic notebook and said, "But since the Ministry of National Defense has handed you over to me, and since Mr. President trusts me, I have to do something. To tell you the truth, in 10 days, we will be parachuting to Planet 163 to carry out an extremely risky mission. Believe me, after this mission is completed, the chances of you surviving are not high." Apart from a few powerful ruffians, most of the soldiers' expressions changed drastically. If it was said that Su Li's previous words had made them angry, then the revealed mission made them feel endless fear. Su Lo wasn't lying. According to the analysis in Zhou Yu's email, the Federation government had to do something in order to silence the George Carlin faction and the Green Dragon Mountain faction that was preparing to take advantage of the situation. Regardless of whether it was because of his anger or because he wanted to appease the anger of the people, President Parable had to let these people go to the real front lines and accept the real test of blood and fire. And he was the sword in President Parable's hand. Recognizing this fact clearly, Su Lo didn't feel too heavy or angry. He had always admired Pobre, what Mr. Sher called his own president. This president had rescued him from prison. The president had always displayed a moral integrity that was completely different from the politicians. The president was an exception in the political history of the Federation. He was an exception that deserved the sincere protection of people like Su Lo, so he was willing to work hard to complete the mission given by the president. As for the sons of these important figures in the Federation, if they wanted to live, they had to change their attitude towards life. If they died, Su Lo believed that he wouldn't have too many tears to shed. He looked at the few powerful ruffians in the back of the crowd who didn't hide their cold, arrogant, and wild expressions. His brows furrowed. These bodybuilders of the 17th Division looked as cold and callous as Du Shaoqing's soldiers, but they hadn't learned the iron 7th Division sense of discipline at all. It was truly a bit annoying. Yan Bingyan, Lu Qingsong. He called out the names of those people and said, "You guys stay here. The rest of you start running laps until I tell you to stop." This was an order to half disperse. At this moment, the soldiers who had fallen into shock, panic, and anger didn't follow the order to run. Instead, they stared at Su Lo with eyes that were about to spit fire, as if they wanted to melt the cold sunglasses on his face. "We're not going," someone shouted loudly. Shiping said coldly, "We demand freedom of communication." The son of another senator shouted angrily, "Why do we have to go to the front lines? Since when can the garrison area fight in a foreign land? You have to give us an explanation, or else we want the Ministry of Defense to give us an explanation." As soon as the son thought of going to war with those beast-like Empire people, his face turned pale with fright. He pulled at his hair in pain, completely unable to understand what was happening before his eyes. He couldn't inform his father, family, or girlfriend. Did he have to go to the front lines in such a muddled manner? Under the influence of all kinds of emotions, the crowd began to become agitated. They protested loudly and angrily. They had no intention of leaving at all. Instead, they surrounded Su Lo and the members of the 7th Division. They were not real soldiers of the Federation in the first place. Suddenly realizing that they were about to face an iron-blooded war, the desire to survive, the fear of being forgotten, and the hatred for Su Li's attitude mixed together and turned into a kind of tide of excitement. Bai Yuan glanced at Su Lo, using her gaze to ask if they needed to suppress him. Su Lo shook his head, used his index finger to push up his sunglasses, and walked towards the back of the crowd. The old soldiers didn't run laps after disbanding, and those few strong soldiers he had named also didn't stay behind as ordered. Instead, they returned to the training equipment without any discipline. They began to flex their muscles again, silently and disdainfully spraying the smell of hormones as a silent demonstration and protest. The heavy training equipment collided continuously, producing dull metallic sounds. The muscular men in the tight singlets were drenched in sweat. They looked at the approaching Su Lo, but had no intention of getting up at all. Among them, the second lieutenant named Yen Bingyen looked at Su Le provocatively with a mocking smile, revealing a mouthful of white teeth. His smile wasn't sunny at all, but fierce and ruthless. Yen Bingyen, the 17th Division's record holder for many training events in the past 3 years. For this monster, running 10 kilometers with weights was as easy as taking a stroll. Right now, the weight displayed on the electronic positioning weight training equipment he was using had already reached its peak, but he was still able to easily reveal a hint of mockery in his smile. When the soldiers beside the training equipment heard that they were going to the front lines, they weren't as panicked as the old soldiers. Instead, they were faintly excited. It was just that they were used to being undisciplined in Hong Kong, and more importantly, they were a little aggrieved by the National Defense Department's ruthless methods and angered by Su Lee's attitude, so they were exceptionally tough. I didn't ask you to stay behind to train with these weights. Su Le looked at the guys beside the equipment and said, "Are you kids who want to play? Or are you guys male prostitutes who specialize in bodybuilding and then flirt with rich ladies? Otherwise, why can't you leave these things for even a moment?" With a muffled thud, Yen Bingyen came down from the equipment with an ashen face. The heavy weight landed heavily on the receiver, and the steel handle, which was about 3 fingers thick, shook up and down. The rest of the strong men also came down from the equipment and stood behind Yen Bingyen, coldly looking at Su Le and the people behind him. "Sir, I think it's best to take back those words." Yen Bingyen stared into his eyes and said, "Of course I don't dare to threaten you, but to say that the equipment used by the military is the means of a male prostitute, I feel that this is an unacceptable humiliation. Of course, you may not be good at these things." Yen Bingyen looked at him with a hint of mockery, "But I think that no matter what army, the strong should always receive a certain amount of respect." "Very good, respect the strong. At least we have one thing in common." Su Le looked at him and suddenly said, "De Xiong, let this strong man try holding your weapon." As the gunner of Group 7, Xiong Linchuan's strength was unparalleled. Even in the entire federal military, he could be ranked at the forefront. Hearing this, Bai Yulan and the others instantly understood what the supervisor wanted to do, and their lips curled up slightly. Initially, Xiong Linquan had been the one who disliked Su Le the most, but after interacting with him in the training base, after graduating from the Japanese academy, he had become the one who admired Su Le the most. After hearing the order, he ran back without hesitation. Half a minute later, he carried his favorite weapon. The strong men beside the training equipment looked at the heavy Darlin rotary cannon in Xiong Linchuan's hands, and their expressions turned ugly. In the Federation's military camp, there were many fierce people who could use the Darlin rotary cannon, which was specially used for mecha and fighter jets. In fact, every one of them could be said to be a legend, but this guy in front of them was actually carrying it so easily. Could this really be his standard weapon? "Don't force yourself," said Xiong Linquan sincerely as he carefully handed the heavy machine gun in his hands to Yen Bingyen. Of course, he wouldn't sympathize with the guy in front of him, wondering if his wrist would break with a snap. He was only worried that this seemingly tough guy would break the equipment he used to make a living. Yen Bingyen's expression was ugly, but also serious and stubborn. He took a deep breath, and the muscles on his arms bulged as he took the Darlin rotary cannon. Being able to lift the Darlin rotary cannon with one hand showed that this ace soldier of the 17th Division indeed had extraordinary strength. However, his face was slightly red, and his right shoulder was trembling. If he wanted to use the Darlin rotary cannon to shoot everywhere on the battlefield, it would obviously be impossible. From this point of view, he was much weaker than Xiong Linquan. 2 seconds later, Xiong Linquan snatched the Darlin rotary cannon away, shook his head, and turned to leave. Yen Bingyen's face was still red. Other than using too much strength, he was more embarrassed. However, he wasn't convinced, because in the military camp, strength wasn't everything. Sulu didn't need to look at the strong man's expression to know what he was thinking. He extended his hand to Bai Yulan and said, "Give me your uniform." Bai Yulan took off his uniform without hesitation. Sulu walked over to the weight training apparatus that Yan Bingyan had previously used to train, and carefully rolled up Bai Yulan's uniform onto the pure steel handrail. He glanced at the maximum weight value displayed on the apparatus, and knew that it was left behind by Yan Bingyan. He remained silent. Everyone present thought that he was going to show off his strength. The men of Group 7 began to shrug their shoulders, but Yan Bingyan and the people behind her had a suspicious look on their faces. They always felt that although this lieutenant colonel was a little too young, it was impossible for him to have so much strength just by looking at his body. Chapter 441. There was a very soft cracking sound. Almost at the same time, there were two more cracking sounds, so that most of the people present did not hear the first sound. Only Sulu knew that it was definitely not the sound of his own metacarpal bones breaking. There was a large hole in the right armpit of his military uniform. The layers of Bai Magnolia's military uniform that were wrapped around the steel armrest were also torn into two pieces. Sulu retracted his palm and lowered his head to look at the damage on his right armpit. He said to Bai Magnolia, who was beside him, with a bitter smile, "Both uniforms seem to be damaged." Bai Magnolia nodded and did not say anything. However, she was just as shocked as the people around her. She and the men of Team 7 had long been accustomed to Su Li's extraordinary strength. Of course, they knew that his palm strike was not just for the two uniforms. His target must have been the pure steel armrest wrapped under the uniforms. The problem was, that was a pure steel armrest that was nearly 3 fingers thick. Sulu had chopped it with his bare hand. Did he really think that his palm was made of superalloy? Although Bai Yulan and the other members of Group 7 had absolute faith in Su Li's abilities, they still couldn't hide their shock when they saw this scene. They were even more curious about what had become of the pure steel armrest under the tattered military uniform. Yan Bingyan and those bodybuilders did not understand the shock on these people's faces. They stared at Sulu. They did not understand why this young lieutenant colonel would do such a thing. Could it be that he had a hobby of smashing iron with his own flesh? Sulu looked at Yan Bingyan and these people and said calmly, "The training I have arranged for you is to stand at attention for 4 hours. After that, you will have to do marching and formation training. Because of your serious lack of discipline, even I, a guy who has been in the army for less than a year, can't stand it anymore. The training program will start in 5 minutes. Yan Bingyan snorted and was about to say something, but Sulu ignored her and said, "You said that the strong should be respected. As long as you can do what I just did, I'll allow you the freedom to practice bodybuilding every day." Yan Bingyan and the others were stunned. They didn't understand what he was trying to say. However, at this time, Sulu and the members of Group 7 had already left the equipment area. Lan Xiaolong and Xiong Linquan couldn't help but look back at the military uniform wrapped around the steel armrest. Their eyes were filled with intense curiosity and excitement. It was precisely because of these gazes that the valiant soldiers beside the apparatus could not help but turn their heads to look at the weight-bearing apparatus. The close combat expert named Lu Qingsong finally couldn't bear the strange silent atmosphere and the doubts in his heart. He stepped forward and tore off the military uniform wrapped around the armrest. As the last layer of military uniform was torn off, his right hand suddenly froze. Looking at that place, the expressions of the strong guys beside the equipment suddenly became extremely interesting. Yan Bingyan's pupils shrank, and her face revealed an expression of disbelief. The scene in front of her made her eyes twitch rapidly. The pure steel armrest about the thickness of 3 fingers was connected to the equipment at both ends, but the middle part was broken horizontally. The hard steel rod, at this time, looked like a soft and bleak willow branch. It seemed to be constantly shaking in the breeze of the military camp. A human hand broke a steel pipe, and it was the solid kind. Had such a scene appeared in the army before? Yan Bingyan and Lu Qingsong looked at each other with a pale face and saw the shock and fear in each other's eyes. It seemed that the 4 hours of standing at attention and boring marching training were inescapable. Yan Bingyan thought so in her heart. She subconsciously looked up at the sky, wanting to confirm whether this was a real world. As soon as she looked up, she saw the dark clouds dispersed and the scorching sun in the sky. The training later would be extremely difficult. It broke. It broke. Fuck, it really broke. Lon Xiaolong looked at the movement over there and excitedly patted Xiong Linquan beside him. He lowered his voice and said excitedly. Xiong Linquan looked at Su Lu in front of him and felt that his scalp was a little numb. He was a fierce warrior who lifted cement boards and smashed people. However, after following Su Lu, he found that this well-proportioned and not strange director was the real fierce one. Bai Yulan followed beside Su Lu. She didn't look back, but she already knew what was happening behind her. Her slender eyes that were faintly discernible through her black hair flashed with a trace of shock. Facing a solid steel pipe that was 3 fingers thick, the boss actually dared to use his bare hands to chop it. This was a completely crazy realm and confidence. Su Lu listened to the shocked discussion of the men of Group 7. The thin corners of his lips slightly curled up, showing a trace of pain. He rubbed his red and swollen palm and thought to himself, I was a lunatic who dared to step on mecha, let alone a steel pipe. But the steel pipe is really hard, my hand hurts. The old soldiers of the 17th Division didn't run laps. They stood in front of the military camp and protested loudly. Meanwhile, the young masters of the big shots, including Shiping, were moving their eyes quickly, trying to find a way to communicate with the outside world in this enclosed military camp. These young masters firmly believed that as long as they let the elders of their families know what kind of humiliation and danger they were enduring, they would definitely have a way to interfere with this inexplicable and crazy action of the military. Why don't you run laps? Su Lu walked in front of them and asked, you should know the rules of the military very well. I don't want to take measures to punish you on the first day. The young popinjays stared at him angrily and didn't say a word. They didn't see the scene that happened by the equipment just now, so they didn't know what kind of terrifying strength this lieutenant colonel with sunglasses had. On the contrary, they habitually used the ability to judge people that they had honed in the upper class of the capital ring to place most of their attention on Su Li's age. Through the wide sunglasses, they seemed to be able to confirm that this lieutenant colonel was very young. To become a high-ranking officer in the military at such a young age, this person definitely had a great background. It was unknown whether or not being transferred to the front line by the Ministry of Defense would involve some hidden storm in the political world. However, if it was a competition of family background, these popinjays definitely didn't need to admit defeat. Shiping didn't answer Su Li's question. With a gloomy face, he said, we were kidnapped. Before we know the reason, I refuse to obey orders. At the very least, you should let us have the freedom of communication that every citizen and soldier should have. Why don't you run laps? Su Lu didn't seem to see this person's face. When he heard this person's words, his eyes were hidden behind the sunglasses as he asked in a soft and dull voice. Not getting any response, Shipeng's face became even uglier. Instead of running, he slowly sat back down on the chair. He stretched out his hand and waved it in the air. A few people followed his lead and sat down in a bold and decisive manner. They wanted to embarrass Su Lu and the men of Group 7 in front of the crowd without any words. After 10 seconds of suppressed silence and tension, no one answered Su Li's question that was repeated for the second time. He glanced at the popinjays who were sitting on the chairs, turned around, and whispered something to Bai Yulan. Bai Yulan's soft eyebrows instantly raised. Like the flowers in spring, there was a hint of awkwardness and solemnity in the gentleness. Hearing Su Li's order, even someone as cold as him felt a little surprised and troubled. These old soldiers in front of him were completely different from the bodybuilders beside the machines. Their fathers were all famous big shots in the Federation. Even the Ministry of Defense couldn't completely resist the pressure from these families. Group 7 was undoubtedly the best among the mercenaries, but when faced with the pressure from the capital ring and the anger of those big shots, they were just ordinary soldiers. How could they resist? Bai Yulan put his right hand into his trouser pocket. He knew very well that this matter involved President Pabre and the government of the Federation, or even the old man in Philadelphia. However, their target was the politicians and tycoons that made up the Federation. The matter seemed to be very complicated. However, the little boss's order was so simple. Bai Yulan's face was gloomy and uncertain. He deeply felt that his supervisor, this man named Su Lo, seemed to be the best at simplifying complicated things. So he slowly walked forward. The popinjays sat on the chairs with cold expressions, humiliating Su Li's order. However, they looked at the handsome man who was getting closer and closer. They seemed to be able to feel a terrifying aura spreading. They couldn't help but feel a little confused and panicked. Shi Ping stared at Bai Yulan's right hand that was in his trouser pocket and asked, "What do you want to do?" Bai Yulan silently walked forward and took out the delicate military knife from his trouser pocket. Without any warning, the delicate military knife flashed with a beautiful light, cut through the air, and easily pierced into Shi Peng's right shoulder. With a puff, blood spurted out. Shi Peng didn't cry out in pain. His face was pale as he looked at the delicate knife on his right shoulder in shock. He seemed to be so shocked by this ridiculous scene that he didn't know what to say. Someone dared to stab me. That person stabbed me. Someone actually dared to stab me. A scream sounded. The popinjays looked at Shi Peng, who fell on the ground with pale faces and trembled. A few of the braver ones rushed over and hugged Shi Peng in their arms. At the same time, they glared at Bai Yulan and Su Lo and screamed, "Are you crazy? If you don't listen to the order, you will also die if you go to 163. Su Lo looked at the bleeding Shi Peng and naturally thought of the big shot that he had met at the flowing wind slope. He said softly, "I'll give you one more minute. If you still don't want to run laps, I don't mind letting this secretary stab you 2 more times." Song Ji tightly hugged the bleeding Shi Peng. He was trembling with anger and fear. He stared at Su Lo fiercely and shouted, "I'm going to complain to the legal department. I'm going to send you to the military court." Su Lo was silent for a moment and suddenly said, "I forgot to tell you, this is the 7th Combat Team of the Shell Corporation. We are mercenaries, not federal forces. The military court can't control us." The popinjays' faces were pale. Shi Peng was desperately covering his bleeding wound. He stared at Su Lo and roared, "Who the fuck are you? Lon Xiaolong, tell this son of a bitch who I am." Lon Xiaolong quietly hid behind Su Lo. He glanced at the chaotic scene with the corner of his eyes. His heart slightly twitched. He really didn't understand why Su Lo dared to do this. However, at least at this moment, he knew that the baby of the deputy speaker would definitely not be able to get back his face. Yan Bingyan and the other strong men beside the equipment in the distance had already begun to do standing training under the hot sun with ugly expressions. Su Lo looked at these young masters who were gnashing their teeth in anger and fear. After a moment of silence, he took off the sunglasses on the bridge of his nose and said, "I don't care who you are, but I think I should let you know who I am." Chapter 442. It was still that Federation proverb, "A person has a name, a tree has a shadow." Su Lo, this name was extremely ordinary, the slanted shadow behind him not all that austere either. However, When these hedonistic soldiers here heard these two words, saw the ordinary face that was revealed along with the sunglasses on his fingertips, they immediately felt a wave of extremely cold aura envelop the military camp, crushing down on their usually proud and reserved hearts. From a certain perspective, Su Lu was already a great celebrity in the Federation. The people didn't know how many people he had killed, how many great things he had done. The Ministry of National Defense's propaganda department cooperated with the news media, but with the help of the scandal with the nation's young lady, they placed him in front of the spotlight and magnifying glass. Now that this name was spat out from his thin lips, it would no longer be as light as a feather. Once it landed on hard ground, it would definitely forcefully smash open several large craters. The hedonistic soldiers here finally understood why this ordinary-looking fellow was already a Federation lieutenant colonel at such a young age. They finally understood why in front of these people's sense of superiority and family background, he could still be so calm and ruthless, to the extent where he was even a bit more ruthless than they had indulged in imagining. It was because he was Su Lu, the young genius that military god Li Pifu and President Pabre both held in high regard, a target that the federal military focused on nurturing. Regardless of whether it was a competition of background, willpower, strength, or methods, this Federation lieutenant colonel wearing sunglasses, at least in this isolated military camp that was far from bustling life, he had an overwhelming advantage. Xi Ping and the few young masters closest to him weren't those hedonistic sons who drove a few sports cars and whistled a few times just because their fathers had several $100 million in assets. Instead, they were the true young masters who were truly at the top of the capital ring, so they just so happened to know some inside information regarding the name Su Lu. That was why their reactions were even more intense than others. Xi Ping, whose right shoulder was gushing with blood, suddenly had fear in her eyes. Shocked by this name, she fell backwards with a resolute manner, bringing along her group of friends whose faces instantly turned deathly pale. They fell onto the ground in an extremely miserable manner, becoming a mess that in the luxurious and exquisite upper circle of the capital ring. The old and rather shrewd middle-aged bigwigs had a publicly acknowledged evaluation of Su Lu, this person who suddenly rose to prominence. This was a calm madman. He had once smashed the Nutshell Research Institute with his peace axe, and then quietly helped the Nutshell Research Institute set up a MX. He pulled down the old man from the Federal Academy of Sciences and gave him a few ruthless slaps across the face. In the end, this young man surprised everyone. He left behind the picturesque landscape of Mo Cho Back Mountain, left behind the flower-like path drawn by that respectable lady, and quietly went to S2. He wore sportswear, carried a bag of guns, broke into a certain building, and killed that counselor who caused countless headaches and fears. In the eyes of those bigwigs, Su Li's temperament was calm and cheerful, but he had done so many things that were considered crazy by the rules they were accustomed to, especially the abandonment and killing in the end. This showed that this person didn't rely on a moment of excitement to support his cold-blooded methods, but after careful consideration, he still ruthlessly slammed his head into a certain iron wall. He didn't care if his head would bleed, but he didn't care if he smashed a hole in the iron wall or only left a few traces of blood. He didn't care if he would break his head and bleed, but he didn't care if he smashed a hole in the iron wall or only left a few traces of blood. This kind of person was very frightening. A calm madman was even more frightening than the little madman Lees of Philadelphia. Even if Madman Lee dared to rush into Parliament Hill and start a fight, he definitely wouldn't dare to do such a thing. Based on the evaluation of this person in the upper circle, and the legendary death of a certain senator, Xi Ping, who was lying on the ground, couldn't help but feel cold all over as he looked at the calm and sincere officer in front of him. Even if the other party was smiling like a flower under the sun and was as calm as water, he could still smell the blood and see the demon's horns. The fact that Macklin was killed by Su Lu and Shi Qinghai together was one of the Federation's biggest secrets. However, as George Carlin once mockingly pointed out, the Federation's information was not equal. The so-called secrets were originally the fruits of the upper circle's harvest. Therefore, Xi Ping knew, and so did the sons of the governors and senators around him. Xi Ping's uncle was a senior senator of the Federation. The current deputy speaker, Shaun, was compared to Macklin, who had died at the hands of Su Lu. Perhaps because of his long experience in business, his hidden strength and connections were deeper and wider. However, on the surface, he couldn't compare to Macklin's once impressive reputation. It should be known that although Macklin had already withdrawn from the presidential election at that time, he wasn't the villain that was hated by the people today. He still had the support of the people, and the Federation's government and political circle, even terrifying existences like the 7 great families, had to make some kind of compromise. However, this guy in front of him just so unreasonably and brutally killed him. Su Lu even dared to kill Macklin at that time, let alone Xi Ping, who was only his uncle's nephew. Xi Ping's face was pale, and his eyes were wandering. However, he could still clearly feel the pain from the sharp wound on his right shoulder. He was more and more convinced that if he continued to resist, he was afraid that this delicate and feminine man would really stab him to death. After only 2 seconds of silence, Xi Ping tightly pursed his lips and climbed up from the ground with difficulty. He saluted Su Lu and then turned to walk toward the field. His strong will because of his family background, power, and money instantly collapsed and shattered in the face of the simplest and most direct shadow of blood and death. At least in this military camp, he had to endure, stall for time, and wait for his family's response. Su Lu lowered his head and looked at his watch, calculating the time. The foppish soldiers all turned pale and ran toward the field. Su Lu raised his head, put on his sunglasses again, and said a few words to the people behind him. The outstanding battlefield medic of Team 7, Ho Xiandong, immediately reacted and rushed to the field. He pulled Xi Ping to the shade and began to treat the wound on his shoulder. Bai Yulan's stab was not deep, but the wound was a little long and there was a lot of blood. It looked a little scary. They were the mercenaries of Nutshell Company and did not seem to have to worry about the existence of military discipline or military court. However, no matter how cold and silent Su Lu was, he would not stab his subordinates to death just because they did not attend training. Strangely, however, many people seemed to think that Su Lu was really a terrifying person who killed without batting an eyelid. The foppish soldier running toward the field was the last to follow the symbol. Su Lu called out to him. After a moment of silence, he said, "Don't embarrass the old principal." The symbol's face was covered in bruises and bruises. He did not know that his father was the principal of Yue University. At home, he often heard his father talk about the legend of this little gatekeeper in front of him. Su Lu had never received professional training in the military camp. He had never run weight-bearing training. He had only followed Bai Yulan for a period of time to learn about firearms and standard mecha operation. Those tactical manuals were also just his hobby reading, so naturally, he could not be responsible for the training of more than 100 subordinates. In fact, he did not understand these things. After confirming that the breath of these old soldiers had been completely suppressed, he put on his sunglasses and returned to his room. He began to use the military communication system to send frequent technical emails to Shang Qiu, who was far away in Hong Kong. During this period of time, the engineering department of Nutshell Company had begun to experiment with the turbine compression idea that Shang Qiu's Mr. Qing Fengshe had proposed. They were in a state of excitement and anxiety. The engineering department missed him very much, and he also missed the atmosphere of the past. Bai Yulan was fully in charge of the training, with Lan Xiaolong assisting. Those old soldiers with extremely poor military qualities were undergoing a horrendous training on the field. Xiong Linquan held a spiked leather boot and roared, forcing those people to move faster and faster. As long as someone slowed down or collapsed, a few whips would cut through the air, leaving behind a few bloody scars. Fortunately, the Department of National Defense was extremely generous to the point of being extravagant. Dr. Ho Xiandong skillfully and excitedly operated those medical pods, injecting all sorts of medicine into those old soldiers who had fainted from exhaustion. He could absolutely guarantee that these young masters would not be left with any physical injuries. Cured. Continue to train. As the saying goes, if you train hard, you will be like a dog. Even if you are scolded, you will not bark. This was the miserable life of the 17th Division's old soldiers on their first day in the West Woods. On the other side of the field, Yan Bingyan, Lu Qingsong, and the rest of the bodybuilders or record holders were undergoing military posture and formation training under the scorching sun. The long period of standing still had turned them into wooden dummies. Then, under the scorching sun, they turned into dried corpses. Their skin began to crack and float. You know, the so-called mapping mission is to help the Bureau of Proclamation sneak into the enemy's territory to install the chip. There are only 10 days left before we depart. I admit that your training level is very cruel, but with only 10 days, can you really create a real fighting force for Sulu? In the shadows at the edge of the barracks, Lon Xiaolong unbuttoned his collar and looked at the soldiers on the field who were like stray dogs. He frowned and said, "Boss just wants them to have fewer deaths on the battlefield. At least when they are escaping, they need to be able to keep up with the speed of the 7th Division." Bai Yulan took a puff of her cigarette and answered softly, "Why did you stab him?" "That guy is the nephew of the vice-chairman of Shihen." Lon Xiaolong looked at the field and said worriedly, "You should be very clear about the background of these old soldiers in the division. Sulu has the background of the army god and the appreciation of the president, so he shouldn't be afraid of anything. But you are just a slightly more powerful stinky soldier. If these big shots want to crush you, they only need to move their little finger." Bai Yulan took a puff of her cigarette and knew that Lon Xiaolong was telling the truth. Even the Ministry of National Defense didn't dare to touch these old soldiers. Although these guys were suppressed now, who knew what would happen in the future? But he still remained silent. Lon Xiaolong was silent for a moment. He turned his head and stared at the pair of slender eyes through the black hair. He said very seriously, "You keep insisting on calling him boss. Are you really going to sell your life to this guy?" Chapter 443. Bai Yulan took another puff of her cigarette. Her face, which was covered by her black hair, did not change in the slightest because of Lon Xiaolong's sudden question. She said softly, "The ministry gave Group 7 a mission. Originally, they only had 3 days to prepare. In the morning, the boss made a call to the West Mountain compound. After an angry argument over the phone, the 3 days became 10 days. The ministry has to give him face. I stabbed him because I want him to be more efficient during the 10 days that he fought for. If too many of the children of these big shots die in the hands of the boss, even if Fei Qing and the minister want to protect him, there will be too many problems." Lon Xiaolong looked at him and continued to ask, "Why did you want to risk your life for him?" Bai Yulan pressed the cigarette against the wall, leaving a deep black mark. The flame went out, leaving behind a trace of heat. That year, the new mecha failed. President Sieg was furious. The Bureau of Proclamation started to investigate Nutshell's illegal activities. Group 7 was thrown out as a scapegoat by some important people. In order to protect Xiong Linquan and the others, you shouldered all the responsibility and were sent to the military court. Although you were lucky to get away with it, you were expelled from the army forever. From that day onwards, you quit smoking. You swore that you would never smoke again. You said that you wanted to be healthy and live a long life. Lon Xiaolong looked down at the cigarette between his fingers and said, "But after you started following Sulu, you started smoking again. We know your personality and what it means to break your oath. Before we left the capital ring, Ninghe came looking for me. He felt that your personality had become too calm and cold, like a crazy demon. It was after Ninghe's wedding that Su looked stabbed by Yulan in the back. Thinking about that time, Bai Yulan narrowed his eyes, as if he could still feel the pain in his back. After a moment of silence, he said softly, "In the past 6 months, you've been brainwashing the people of Group 7 every day. You want to make Xiong Jiaozi and the others worship the boss so much that they have the urge to hug the boss to sleep. Didn't the Department of Defense send you here to help him gather Group 7 first, then slowly gather the 17th Division? Since your mission is to put the lives of many people in the hands of the boss, what's wrong with me doing my best?" After receiving an affirmative answer, Lon Xiaolong, who was used to mocking the Federation with a sarcastic tone, froze. Uneasiness and worry gradually spread out of his eyes, but the words that came out of his mouth were still as sharp as ever. "Our genius manager is destined to become a big figure. Lord War God, the Department of Defense has been paving the way for him for the past year, and I'm the coolie who sprinkles the cement. The problem is that there has to be a limit to any decision. As the guy at the bottom of the pile of materials, if we work too hard, we can only become countless crushed stones in the future, embedded in the cement and paved on his golden path. When he steps on the road with his shiny military boots, his path is straight, and he won't think about the crushed stones under his feet." Bai Yulan lowered his head and leaned against the wall. His fingers let go of the cigarette and his right leg bent to push against the wall. He answered quickly and directly, "I joined the army when I was young. In this life, I've killed many people and seen many things. Assassinating Bermuda merchants for the government, smuggling for the young masters in the military, robbing pirate ships. I've done many bad things in my life. I don't have any respect for morality or self-pity. I can't say that I have a heart of stone, but I'm very indifferent." He continued, "Our Group 7 has always been the most arrogant and powerful combat team in the nutshell. As the combat manager, on one hand, I did some shady things for the government, and on the other hand, I did some dark things to earn money. I always thought that I had a good life. However, when I started working as Su Li's secretary, I gradually realized that this kind of life was the happiest. The year when I went back and forth between the capital and Hong Kong was the most relaxing and comfortable life of my life." Bai Yulan raised his head and used his slender fingers to lift the black hair in front of his eyes. His gentle and quiet face was full of a relaxed smile. "I originally thought that following Su Lo was just a way to earn money. However, after he got into trouble, I suddenly found that my life was very unpleasant. I was even more surprised that a cold-blooded person like myself could have such unhappiness and uneasiness. Maybe it's because this young guy once inexplicably gave me some trust that I didn't expect." Bai Yulan narrowed his eyes like Su Lo and looked at the soldiers running on the field. He shrugged his shoulders like Lon Xiaolong and said, "On the day of Ninghe's wedding, he stabbed me, but I felt much better. It's not that I'm cheap. It's just that I know that I can go back to those days that made me feel relaxed." He looked at Lon Xiaolong and said in a soft but firm voice, "Working with Su Lu gives me a strong sense of being grounded. I feel proud that my spine can always be straight and I don't have to be afraid of being killed. The things we used to do were not strange, or arrogant. But they were very, very hard as steel. We were not afraid of gossip and we were not afraid of asking ourselves. We could straighten our backs and report the results of our work to our parents who were lying in the hospital. If possible in the future, we can look back proudly on our children when we are old. There is no one or thing that is always right. But following Su Lo and doing things that we think are right, this kind of feeling is very good." Lon Xiaolong listened in silence. He understood what kind of feeling Bai Yulan was trying to describe in his soft voice. However, he increasingly felt that Ninghe's worries were reasonable. Bai Yulan did not worship Su Lo, but he was immersed in the pleasure of a madman. This kind of situation was quite dangerous. Do you know? On the day Medellin died, I was on the mountain outside the foundation building. Bayulan's slender eyes flashed a trace of sharpness. He said softly, at that time, I had a strong impulse to go crazy with him. In fact, I was ready to go crazy at that time. Lan Xiaolong's face changed dramatically. He could not believe his friend's words at this moment. Unfortunately, I received a call on the mountain at that time. Bai Yulan said bitterly. The image of a middle-aged woman appeared in his mind. She didn't look extraordinary, but her face was full of majesty. Immediately, he calmly raised his head and said, That's why I didn't go crazy that day. I didn't have enough fun. Now that I have a second chance with Su Lo, I don't want to miss it. Lan Xiaolong sighed softly and no longer tried to persuade him. Bai Yulan patted his shoulder with a smile and said, Like the boss, I am a small figure who struggled at the bottom of the society. As George Carlin said, we are naturally revolutionary. Dealing with the young masters of these big shots will produce a certain kind of pleasure from the bottom of my heart. Your family background is different from ours, so naturally, you can't understand. After saying a rare long psychological analysis, the delicate man put his hands back into his trouser pocket. The smile on his face gradually disappeared. The delicate lady lowered her head and walked toward the old soldiers on the field. Lan Xiaolong looked at the back of the figure. Thinking of the countless dead souls under the delicate knife of his friend and the sinister means hidden in his body, he could not help but shiver. He sympathized with the children of the senators, governors, and tycoons. It had to be admitted that as a personal secretary who did not make the bed but served tea and water for a long time, Bai Yulan had a very good grasp of Su Li's mind. In the following days, the more than 100 old soldiers from the capital ring were miserably dealt with by Bai Yulan, Xiong Linquan, and the others. From day to night, this remote and quiet military camp in the West Woods was filled with miserable howls, cries, screams of despair, and even more desperate cries for mercy. Running with weights, shooting with weights, and then running with weights again, whipping, kicking, drugs, and obviously illegal black market stimulants. Blood and snot were smeared on the tattered military uniforms. Bruises and ulcers were constantly rubbing against the sand. Occasionally, someone would fall, and some would be so weak that they would vomit bile. The sun and moon in the West Woods witnessed countless tragic scenes. Medic Ho Xiandong stared at the piles of hemostatic tape and more than 10 empty adhesive bottles in the room. He also stared at the unconscious soldiers in the healing pods. Even though he was a professional and calm military doctor, he could not help but feel a chill run down his spine. But their commanding officer, Manager Su Lo, who was a genius in Group 7, but was also calm, kind, and optimistic, had allowed this to happen. However, contrary to Bai Yulan's description of George Carlin's theory, Su Lo did not have any hidden pleasure or displeasure in the torture of the old soldiers of the 17th Division. He was only doing things according to some strict engineering logic. Moreover, he was so busy that he did not have the time or mood to enjoy the mental world of a sadist. Under the white energy-saving lights, Su Lo closed his eyes and adjusted the blueprint stored in his mind. After a moment of thought, he slowly opened his eyes and sent the completed email to Shang Qiu, who was billions of miles away. Miniaturizing the turbocharger system into a mecha was an extremely difficult task. Cheng Fengshi had proposed a whimsical design concept. After the even more talented Shang Qiu had obtained the materials, she had immediately erased the hydrogen fuel foundation in the original design. The Nutshell engineering department worked at full strength. In just a few short days, the project had achieved a great breakthrough. In the past few days, Su Lo had been in constant email contact with his colleagues in the Nutshell engineering department. The main reason was that he was anxious to make his own contribution to the problem of the leaf absorption interference before he went to the front lines. Standing by the window, He rubbed his eyes and silently watched the old soldiers struggling on the field like sick dogs under the moonlight. He knew that these people had been tortured to the brink of despair and collapse. What comforted him was that under such strict training, none of the 100 or so soldiers tried to use self-harm to escape. Perhaps it was because these young masters did not have the courage to harm themselves. He looked at those extremely weak subordinates of his, watching as their eyes grew brighter and brighter, filled with a certain kind of hatred. He felt rather satisfied. Right at this moment, his phone rang. Su-Luk picked up the phone and listened quietly. His expression gradually became serious. The endless pressure from the upper echelons of the capital ring had finally arrived. Chapter 444. With the level of technology of the Federation, it was easy to create a wall that did not allow even a trace of wind to pass through. The Department of Defense secretly sent military police to escort more than 100 old soldiers of the 17th Division onto the warship and blocked off any means of communication. Quietly, like thunder, they were sent to the front lines of the West Woods. It was done flawlessly, but in the end, it could not escape the eyes and ears of everyone. The identities of these old soldiers were too sensitive. When the big shots of the upper echelons of the Federation were shocked to discover that their sons were missing, even with the strict discipline and execution of the federal military, it was impossible to stop the anger of these big shots and their efforts to find out the truth. These politicians and tycoons used their network of contacts throughout S1 to touch upon the truth of the entire incident in a very short amount of time. Faced with the measures taken by the President and the Department of Defense to quell the anger of the people, these big shots of the Federation knew that their influence was limited. Because they lacked a solid moral foundation, they were unable to operate in an open and above-board manner. Naturally, it was difficult for them to break through the iron wall of the Federation military camp. However, the cries and curses of countless family ladies made the big shots ponder. After some contemplation, they began to exert their powerful influence in certain areas in an attempt to bring those young masters back before they entered the truly bloody and cruel front lines of the West Woods. This was a magnificent rescue operation. The Federation press did not catch a whiff of the news. The ordinary people and even the majority of the people within the military system did not feel the scent of anxiety hidden in the night conversations on the radio. Federation senators, state senators, governors, chairmen of large enterprises in Hong Kong, these big shots were the cornerstones of the upper echelons of the Federation society. Once they were angry and collectively exerted pressure, how terrifying would that be? Under the silent statement of Minister Zhou Yingxing, the Department of Defense withstood part of the pressure, but it was also somewhat hard-pressed. As for the specific implementation of this plan, Nutshell Corporation, they had already felt the arrival of the storm. Without a doubt, Nutshell Mobile was the most powerful existence in the Federation and had a transcendent status. However, this largest megacorporation of the Federation was owned by the Federation. In many aspects, it was subject to the checks and balances of the Federation Management Committee. Once those big shots found out that their precious son was currently trapped in a strange unit called Team 7 of the Nutshell Corporation, all of the pressure poured down on them. The first call that Su-Lu received was from the president of the Nutshell Company, whom he had not seen for a long time. The change of the president of the Federation did not affect the president's position. With the support of President Pobre, the president calmly and powerfully controlled everything in this giant corporation. However, this call showed that, even he could not withstand the power of the Capital Ring's rescue operation. The Federation's parliament is about to conduct a spring financial audit. Every year, I have to attend that damned hearing. The parliament members all want to take a bite out of our bare shell. If, and I'm saying if, those sons of the parliament members really die in Group 7, I really don't know what will happen in the parliament. Su-Lu held the phone and said, "I understand." The president of the Nutshell Corporation's voice was a little tired. He said, "Can you apply sick leave for some of them?" Su did not spend time thinking about what the president meant. He looked at the young masters who were enjoying their miserable lives under the moonlight on the field and smiled. He showed his white teeth and said sincerely, "They are not sick or in pain." The president heard the stubbornness hidden in this guy's words. After a moment of silence, he smiled bitterly and said calmly, "I'm not giving you pressure. Just follow the orders of the Department of Defense and do what you want. My brother is now in Group 3320. The things that those parliament members have done are indeed a little ugly." Su felt a little warm. Just as he was about to say something, he heard the president say, "There's one thing that I have to tell you. The fathers of the old soldiers under you already know that they are in Group 7. The Nutshell Corporation is just a corporation. We don't want to take on this kind of pressure for the government or the military, so, well, I've already told these big shots that you are in charge of Group 7. Su was slightly taken aback. After a while, he said hesitantly, "You're expecting me to hold them back? If even you can't hold them back, there shouldn't be anyone in the Federation who can," the president said with a smile on the phone. Mr. President and the war god had both cultivated him. The key was that he had once shown his ruthlessness to the so-called upper class of the Federation. To hold back the big shots rescue operation in Group 1, it had to be Su. He knew this very well himself. The president had chosen him to be this knife because he had thought things through. "You're in the West Woods." Su looked at the phone in his hand and suddenly realized. The president replied with a smile, "Of course. To provide logistical support for the Federal Army, I have to be here to hold the line. Although you are now a lieutenant colonel in the General Assembly base, if one day you don't want to stay in the active military, you can quickly return to the Nutshell Corporation. No matter if it's the Research Institute or the Engineering Department, you can choose any position you want. The first-class technical director position will always be reserved for you. The Federation may lose the youngest general in the future, but it will definitely gain the youngest independent technical director." For a giant like the Shell Motor Company, the employee who had made the greatest contribution in the past 10 years was, of course, Su, who had brought countless glory and achievements to the Nutshell Corporation. However, when he suddenly heard this sentence, he still felt a little warm. He replied to the phone, "I'm still an employee of the Nutshell Corporation. Don't forget that I'm in charge of Group 7. As for the independent technical director..." He thought of that rainy night in Hong Kong, the middle-aged man who had been bribed by the Li family. He said, "I think Shang Qiu is more qualified than me." Just as the president of the Nutshell Corporation said, the big shots of S1 suddenly found that the frontline commander of their son was, the legendary Su. The rescue operation suddenly stopped. It wasn't that they were scared by Su Li's fierce background, but they were actually more worried about their son's life. It was just that when the Ministry of Defense and the Nutshell Corporation shamelessly used Su Li's name, the big shots couldn't find a suitable method. Between the picturesque scenery of the back mountain, the villa stood proudly in the mountains by the lake. In the early morning, kingfishers sang in the valley, but it wasn't necessarily because of the villa. It was more likely that the birds looked at the snow on the mountain and were angry that they couldn't find a way to find the fruit. Secretary Shen walked to the balcony with heavy steps and looked at his wife who was admiring the snow under the skylight. His eyes moved away from the black mink fur coat and said calmly, "The confidential secretary of the Parliament Hill office called again." His tone was very anxious. "Sheetan only has one nephew, and they protect him like a treasure. Now he has been taken to the front line in the West Woods by the Ministry of Defense and thrown into Su Li's army. Of course he would be anxious." Lady Tai looked at the snow valley and said with a frown, "I can understand how he feels, but this is after all Mr. President's idea, and Minister Zhou is carrying it out." The shining appearance of President Pabre and Minister Zhou Yingxing in the Federation's political arena had too much to do with this lady in the back mountain. Although Lady Ty's brows occasionally showed a thoughtful expression, guessing the ultimate goal of Mr. President, she didn't want to personally interfere and destroy the political intentions of her allies. They understand this very well, Secretary Shin said. Listening to them, they want to directly talk to Su Lo and ask for our permission. For the upper class of the Federation, although Lieutenant Colonel Su Lo, who suddenly rose to prominence in the capital, had some problems with Macho in the back mountain, because of his friendship with the Crown Prince, he was still deeply engraved with the brand of the Tai family. Lady Tai picked up half of the best quality agarwood from the table and gently inhaled it. After a moment of silence, she said, I won't stop them, but in my opinion, wanting to directly persuade Su Lo to save their useless children is just a wishful thinking. Shunli understood that he only needed to relay the first half of his wife's words to the Parliament Hill. He lowered his head and entered the command on the work screen. That little guy is stubborn and doesn't care about anything. Even I can't subdue him, let alone those people. Lady Tai thought indifferently in her heart as she tightened the fur coat on her body and looked at the lonely pieces of ice on the lonely lake in front of the stage. In her opinion, old Jean was a heartless and heartless person who couldn't be coerced. His only student, Su Lo, walked a completely different temperament path. But she didn't know whether it was fate or this young man with small eyes was really cautious. It was rare that Su Lo could rely on relationships that he could control. If it wasn't the daughter of the Minister of Defense, it would be his own son, or the slick son of an aristocratic family like Li Laoqi. As for the national girl in the scandal, it was even more difficult to control her. Thinking of this, Lady Tai's eyes showed a trace of appreciation and doubt. She thought back to Su Li's life after he escaped from Donglin. She always felt that this life path had a faint shadow of someone, or else there was no way to explain it. Su Lo is very affectionate, but he is careful to avoid contact with ordinary people. If this is really intentional, I seem to have underestimated him. Lady Tai said softly, he seems to be more cautious than you. Secretary Shen, who was standing behind her, frowned slightly. A trace of complicated expression flashed through his eyes. He must love those ordinary lives. He isn't like the sons of nobles or the former emperors who yearn for the rural life and peaceful spring water. Because he is an insignificant person created by those places. Now that he is sitting on the throne of power in the Federation, he is still an insignificant person in his bones. Lady Tai turned slightly and said, he is so careful to stay away from the good things. He must live a lonely life, but it can prove his perseverance and perseverance. This kind of person who has great perseverance and ruthless means, but has the aura of an insignificant person, is very dangerous. Secretary Shen thought with a slight sigh. Probably only Lady Tai could so clearly and easily understand the heart of Su Lo, that seemingly ordinary guy. Chairman Shitan only has one nephew. After a moment of silence, Lady Tai suddenly said, leave this matter to Ah Yuan. He also knows Shipeng. He can't just watch that little guy die. Chapter 445. Secretary Shen's eyes imperceptibly glanced at the piece of top-grade agarwood that was half-burnt yellow. Then, he glanced at the furnishings in the villa that were filled with a mixture of history and power. For some reason, he sensed a trace of stale aura. He had already confirmed it, but today, he particularly clearly felt that Macho, Parliament Hill, those thousand-year-old families, politicians, and tycoons had formed a stale circle that floated in the clouds in the capital ring. Just like the lady in front of him, who had a noble status but was willing to do some housework from time to time, her or their social status would always stand above the ordinary people. They could work hard to fight for the everlasting existence of the Federation, but the goal of their struggle would always be to let their family gain more benefits through the existence of the Federation. This was a natural attribute, a family's instinct. They maintained the existence of the Federation to protect their families' interests, and President Pobre and the Department of Defense had violated this fundamental interest by transferring those young masters to the West Woods. If they could not even protect the lives of their children, then what were the big shots in the upper class of the Federation fighting for? After the call from the CEO of Nutshell, Su Lu, who was in the military camp in the West Woods, received a lot of phone calls and video mails. But just as Lady Tai had predicted, the stubborn Su Lu did not even flinch in the face of the secret pressure from the capital ring. He did not reply to those emails and hung up on many of the calls that were filled with roaring voices. The action of the big shots in the capital ring to save their precious son pierced through the two iron plates of the Federation government and the Department of Defense and directly arrived in front of the 7th Combat Group, but they were all blocked by Su Lu, who was a hard rock. Whether it was threats, temptations, anger, or resentment, the big shots in the upper class were all displayed in front of him, but they were all useless. However, when he found out that the emails and phone calls that were pleading for him included Secretary Jiao and Mrs. Zhong, two acquaintances, he could not help but feel a little gloomy. Secretary Jiao was Secretary Zhou Yingxing's most trusted confidential secretary, while Mrs. Zhong was the mistress of the West Woods region. Both of them had a close relationship with Su Lu. In the wee hours of the morning, Su Lu even received an email from the office of the president's official residence. The sender was actually Mr. Breen, the director of the office. He looked at the soldiers who were undergoing cruel training on the field and couldn't help but be shocked by the influence of these guys' fathers. Fortunately, the three people who really had influence over Su Lu were very clear about his temperament. They just mentioned a few people's names in the email and tried to sound him out like Mr. CEO, to see if it was possible for him to apply for sick leave. When they received Su Li's direct rejection, they never tried again. Secretary Jiao was the Minister of Defense's trusted aide, and Madame Zhong and Director Breen were even more so big shots who could cause storms with just a wave of their hand. However, they still had to live in this society and that circle of the Federation after all. Just like the proud and noble Madame Zhong, they also had to consider the upcoming budget meeting of the Parliament in spring and how much resource aid quota the West Forest region could receive. In the underworld, under the stars, there were always many things that one had to do. Su Lu understood this very well, so after he closed the email system, he only had a few traces of a heavy and bitter smile on his face. He did not have too much resentment. He should have been resentful because this was President Pobre and the Department of Defense's plan. He was just the knife, but now the President's official residence and the Department of Defense had shamelessly thrown him out to fend off the angry means of the big shots to get him back. Secretary Jiao and Breen even turned around and fired a shot. When he returned to the capital ring in the future, how many big shots would he have to bear the anger of when he returned? The reason why he was still calm and firm and had no resentment was probably because from the beginning, he did not care about the pressure from the capital ring and the possible revenge in the future. He confirmed that the president's idea was correct, and that was enough. He himself did not have the desire to enter the so-called upper circle. Moreover, life and death on the battlefield were rare and common, and no one knew if they could come back alive. If that was the case, what was there to be afraid of? Looking at the moonlight and the stars on the field outside the window that were getting fainter and fainter, and looking at the willow white that was about to tear the horizon apart, Su Lu felt a little relieved that he did not receive the interceding email from the president of Yue University. Although he was not very familiar with the old president, the campus where Yue University was in full bloom was the place where he made his debut, and it was difficult to tear apart their relationship. If the old president was really worried about the life and death of his symbol through the phone, how should he deal with it? The darkness before dawn had dispersed. He looked at the old soldiers who had collapsed on the field, and the members of Group 7 who were equally exhausted and the non-stop medical equipment around them. For some reason, he thought of the lecture he had given a few days ago. I am your highest officer, Su Lu. 3 years ago, he had stood beside the iron gate of Yue University and said in a calm and confident manner, "I am the gatekeeper." Thinking of his life as a gatekeeper in Yue University, Sulo could not help but feel as if a lifetime had passed. Now, his identity and status had undergone a great change, but fortunately, his temperament seemed to be the same as before. That night, more than 120 soldiers of Group 7 gathered in the auditorium for a group meal before heading to the front lines. Before the meal, there were no high-ranking officers to provoke the hot-blooded and loud lectures, nor were there any female celebrities with bare thighs to boost morale. There was only silence. The soldiers, whose bodies were exhausted and in extreme pain, and the bodybuilders, whose skin was cracked under the scorching sun, sat at the dining table and each had their own thoughts. A feeling of despair and sorrow broke away from these thoughts and enveloped the entire auditorium. After 9.5 days of hellish training, these soldiers had tasted for the first time what it meant to be better off dead. If it were not for the hope that their parents in the capital ring could save them at the last moment, they would not have been able to last so long under the whips of Group 7. In fact, even Bai Yulan and Xiong Linquan, who were in charge of training, were extremely tired and sleepy. They sat silently at the table without saying a word. After the high-energy meal was hastily finished, the soldiers sat with numb expressions. There was no problem with their military posture, but their eyes were filled with the desire to die. Going to Planet 163 for the Bureau of Proclamation's secret mission, everyone knew that it was a path with a slim chance of survival. What made them despair was that they would board the battleship tomorrow morning, but their parents still seemed to have not found a way to save them. Sulu walked up to the rostrum and put on the sunglasses carefully. When he lowered his head and was about to say something into the communicator, the phone at his waist rang. Ah Yuan. He was a little surprised to receive a call from the other party. His fingers that were holding the phone froze slightly. He looked at it silently for a long time before he picked up the call. The two words "Ah Yuan" clearly came out from the communicator. The old soldiers who were full of death did not react at all. Only Shi Peng, who had been nervously clenching his fists, suddenly had his eyes lit up. Like a person who was about to fall off a cliff, he suddenly stood up and looked at the rostrum with ecstasy. Su-Lu held the phone and listened silently for a few seconds. Then, he raised his head and looked at Shi Peng. Shi Peng could not believe it. He stretched out his finger and simply hung up the phone. Shi Peng's body tensed up. He could not believe what was happening in front of him. He was instantly overwhelmed by despair. He pushed away the table and rushed to the rostrum. He screamed crazily, "Prince! I'm Shi Peng. Save me!" Su Li's thick eyebrows that were exposed outside the sunglasses slightly frowned. Bai Yulan stood up. When Shi Peng rushed past him, he kicked the outer edge of his thigh heavily. This young master of the speaker's family was kicked to the ground. He could not get up for a while. In the past 10 days, many people have called me in the Ministry of Defense. Su-Lu stood on the rostrum and raised the military encrypted phone in his hand. He did not want to look at Shi Peng, who was rolling on the ground in pain. He looked at the people below the stage and said, "These calls are from your parents and many important people in the capital ring." The originally extremely quiet auditorium immediately became even quieter. It was just that the silence of these soldiers before was filled with grief, indignation, and despair. Now, the silence was more of hope and surprise. Only now did they know that their parents had found out what had happened to them. "You are very impressive. That is because you have very impressive parents." Su-Lu looked at them and lowered his head slightly to look at the phone in his hand that kept vibrating non-stop. He said, "Countless important people have tried to save you. Even the Ministry of Defense could not withstand this pressure and allowed this pressure to reach Group 7 directly." Tai Yuan's name was displayed on the black military phone. It kept ringing silently and with great pressure. Su slowly put his hands behind his back and did not look at it again. Naturally, he would not pick up the call. The old soldiers who had endured 10 days of inhumane torture didn't know why Shiping had gone crazy. They stared at the stage with countless pairs of bright and pleasantly surprised eyes. In their opinion, as long as their parents stepped forward, what couldn't they do in the Federation? However, what they heard next made everyone's mood fall from the warm grasslands to the glaciers of the extreme north. It was so cold after all hope was extinguished. Su raised his head and looked at these new subordinates below the stage. After pausing for a moment, he smiled and said, "Let me tell you guys a piece of good news. The operation in the capital ring to save you guys from the Federation has failed." The entire auditorium was in an uproar. The old soldiers' emotions of fear, grief, and indignation seemed to have materialized and were about to burst through the roof of the auditorium. However, after being tortured for 10 days, they had already developed a deep fear of the members of Group 7. No one dared to stand up and make trouble. The phone kept vibrating non-stop. Su Li's hands behind his back were clenched tightly. He looked at the people below the stage and carefully savored the slight improvement of these soldiers. His confidence increased slightly. After another moment of silence, he said in an extremely sincere tone, "You guys will have a rare opportunity to experience a different part of your life. As members of Group 7 of the Shell Motor Company's Whitewater Battle Group, you guys, will follow the main forces of the Federation with glory and devote yourselves to the great cause of resisting the invasion of the Empire." Chapter 446. The same rice can raise 100 different kinds of people. Although these debauchee soldiers in the auditorium had been raised in a greenhouse by their fathers since they were young, not all of them were really unable to withstand the wind and rain, and couldn't withstand a few days of cold. Knowing that the situation was settled, after a few minutes of silence, some of the more ambitious and strong-willed young masters came back to their senses. They picked up the large bowls of liquor on the table that were specially prepared for tonight. After a moment of shock, their faces gradually became fierce and they drank it all in one gulp. Although some of them were choking, they were choking to their heart's content. They successfully turned the sadness in their hearts into grief and anger, turning despair into a kind of indescribable fierceness. Even Shiping, who had been kicked to the ground, silently crawled up after a moment of pain and struggled to return to her seat. Her face was ashen, as if her entire family had been wiped out. He used his trembling hands to tightly hold the big bowl of liquor in front of him. He screamed like a madman and poured it into his mouth. After drinking this bowl of liquor, he fiercely wiped the liquor on his lips and turned to the source of the cries. He fiercely scolded, "Cry at a funeral." These 100 or so old soldiers were all the best of the 17 divisions, and were naturally part of the same circle. To have such an incompetent comrade, who could not even show his face in public, especially in front of Su Lo and the veterans of Group 7, made them feel extremely embarrassed. After knowing the possible development of the situation, these young masters accepted the reality with a trace of tragic emotion. They were a little flushed from the liquor, but they were also ashamed of the cries that occasionally sounded around them. At this time, when they heard Shipeng's scolding, they also began to scold. Obscenities danced in the air as they vented their curses. Finally, those useless young masters' cries were stifled. "Drink! Drink until you die!" Shiping grabbed Song Xiang's shoulder. The redness in his eyes had long been covered by the redness on his face. He fiercely scolded, "Since no one cares about us, we have to come back alive." The auditorium was suddenly filled with a fierce atmosphere. It was probably the psychological effect of breaking the pot and smashing it. There was wine in the morning, drink in the morning, and kill a few people tomorrow. Su Lo felt that the phone in his hand was no longer vibrating. He secretly heaved a sigh of relief, and then his attention was attracted by the scene in the auditorium. The fact that these old soldiers were able to shake off their despair so quickly was out of his and the members of Group 7's expectations. Although these old soldiers looked at him with eyes full of undisguised hatred, these were still the eyes of those who were alive and dared to seek life in the face of death. He glanced at Shipeng in surprise. Only then did he realize that there was a reason why the aristocratic families condensed their wealth. The young masters of the capital ring had been played by the Department of Defense and tortured by Group 7 for 10 days. That was why they were so cowardly. However, when the young people realized that they could not change the situation, they were able to ignite a certain kind of willpower. It had to be related to their family education. Sulu lowered his head and smiled. He didn't have enough experience or interest to look down on others and feel too much emotion. After calming down a little, he was ready to mobilize for the first battle in his life. However, just as he was about to look at the communicator, he saw from the corner of his eyes a few soldiers carrying miniature cameras and sound receivers walk into the auditorium. Judging from the epaulets of these soldiers, they should be civilian officers. They were probably part of a film crew. Lan Xiaolong walked up to the stage and whispered a few words into his ear. Su Li's eyes narrowed slightly. Only then did he realize that this was the intention of the president's residence and the Department of Defense. In order to quell the anti-war tide among the people, bridge the gap between the social classes, and promote harmonious coexistence between the social classes, the government had specially sent an excellent film crew from the military's Venus documentary film studio to follow Group 7's operation. They wanted to faithfully present the story of the children of these big shots killing the enemy on the front line and sincerely cooperating with the children of ordinary people in front of hundreds of millions of people. This was politics and also propaganda. Sulu understood that the Federation government was willing to offend the upper class to carry out this mission. Of course, they wouldn't miss this rare propaganda opportunity. However, understanding was one thing. For a moment, he found it hard to accept that these people who dabbled in literature and art would appear on a battlefield where death was happening all the time. They're going to start shooting now. Sulu frowned and looked at the film crew that was shooting non-stop below the stage. He thought that the scene of these young masters partying to their heart's content wasn't very nice to look at. Can we ask them to leave for a while? Lan Xiaolong looked at Su Li's face. He didn't understand why he was so against the idea that Group 7 was also his opportunity, so he asked tentatively. Although they are sent by the Department of Defense, you don't need to be so polite. We are just a combat team for nutshell, Sulu said. Okay, I understand. Lan Xiaolong put on his military cap, shook his head, and walked off the stage. He took Xiong Linquan and a few other fierce people and unceremoniously kicked the film crew out of the auditorium. He completely ignored the extremely ugly expression and angry protest of the propaganda officer. Sulu lightly tapped the microphone, and the sharp echo resounded throughout the auditorium. The chaotic scene gradually quieted down. Most of the old soldiers were already a little drunk, and their eyes were a little blurred, confused, and sad. However, after 10 days of torture, none of them dared to show any superiority in front of this young lieutenant colonel wearing sunglasses. Looking at these 120 people and 120 faces, Sulu suddenly forgot what he was supposed to say. The words he thought of last night to boost morale seemed to have no real power in the face of a real war. The Federation soldiers below the stage were only a company. Of course, their equipment was much more powerful than a normal company's. Group 7's equipment was originally provided by Nutshell, and this time, the Department of Defense had directly bypassed the Westwood's frontline command to provide them with a full set of cutting-edge equipment. Sulu was now a lieutenant colonel. If he pushed hard, he could reach the level of deputy division commander, and become the regiment commander would be even more justified. However, he was still too young. Other than the mecha battle last time, he didn't have much combat experience. No matter how much the few real big shots in the Federal Army gave Li Piff a face, no matter how much they loved his personality, they couldn't really throw an entire regiment at him for him to lead. Therefore, these 120 people, this company, was the first time he truly had his own unit. What was his own unit? That was, he had to be responsible for the life and death of everyone in the unit. He narrowed his eyes and looked at these familiar and still unfamiliar faces. He knew that no matter if he liked or disliked them, no matter if they were the son of a senator, the son of a governor, or just a very normal citizen, he had to do his best to let them come back alive from the battlefield. However, in the end, he was still a young man who was almost 22 years old. With such a heavy responsibility and burden on his shoulders, it made his words sound heavy and difficult. You should know some of my story. I haven't been on active duty for long, but I have indeed experienced some things these years. In reality, I should have died a long time ago, but I haven't. Sulu took off his sunglasses and put them in his shirt pocket. He lowered his head slightly and spoke into the communicator. His clear and sincere voice echoed in the auditorium. The soldiers at the tables below the stage looked at him with complicated expressions as they listened to these words. It's the same for your seniors in Group 7. They've done a lot of dangerous and shady work for the Federation, but most of them still managed to survive. Bai Yulan sat at the table. A strange light flashed through her narrow and delicate eyes. It was unknown if she was thinking of her comrades who died on the Bermuda Mineral Star. Sulu lowered his head and continued, if a person is afraid of death, it is actually the easiest for them to die. If you are not even afraid of death, then death will often be afraid of you and will avoid you from afar. I am younger than some of you, but I have experienced life and death. I know that it is indeed not a good feeling. I am also afraid, but after thinking about it carefully, when I rushed to the place of life and death, I didn't rely on the blood rush to my brain. It was an extremely correct instinct. Because people will always die in life. This is inevitable. And there are always some things in the world that are more annoying than death. It is not too risky to gamble with the inevitable death. In the past 10 days, after dinner, I have arranged for you to watch the war documentaries filmed by the Department of Defense. Although some of you may have fallen asleep due to exhaustion, you must have watched a few of them. In those documentaries, you should have seen the Empire's invaders slaughtering our compatriots on the fallen stars. You should have seen the white bones and rotting corpses that were not buried by anyone in the ruins of towns and cities. You should have seen how the Federation soldiers who were about the same age as you bravely charged into the Empire's artillery fire until they became broken corpses or martyrs in the end. I know you have seen it. Sulu raised his head and looked at the silent crowd below the stage. He said, I also know that some of you cried when you saw it. I don't want to know whether it is fear or anger. I don't know whether it is fear, but at least you have feelings. If you don't feel, then you are not human. If you are not human, then you should not be afraid of death. This was not a funny joke. Su Li's first war mobilization in his life was just a calm narration with a hint of naivety and sincerity. The auditorium was silent. He looked at the people below the stage and continued softly, I know that many of you hate me, but I believe that on the battlefield, you will not be so bored as to shoot me in the back. Speaking of this, he thought of Du Shaoqing and the Iron 7th Division, and the trust in the ambush at the Yellow Mountain Ridge. After a moment of silence, he said, I am not an excellent commander, but I can guarantee that you will not be a deserter under my command. In the future, when there is a need to charge, I will charge at the front. When there is a need to retreat, I will stay at the back. This is the only promise I can give you. I won't talk about a glorious future or grand words. If I want to dispel your fears with just a few words and make you scream and become iron-blooded warriors, that's not an extravagant hope. It's just naive. He scratched his head and said seriously, but since you have decided to risk your life on the battlefield, why don't you stick out your chest and walk in style? If the ending is predestined, at least on the way to the end, can you put on a slightly more manly posture? You want to return to the capital ring alive. You have to be brave, and I believe that you can be brave. I am in a very low mood. Until now, I haven't saved a single word of the script. I am going home soon. I feel inexplicably gloomy and irritated. However, when I think of the fact that the national football team can also beat South Korea 3-0, I feel that there is indeed no reason in this universe. I feel both happy and happy. I take a deep breath and cheer myself up. After washing the piled-up clothes and socks at night, I will try to work hard again. Chapter 447. The pre-war mobilization ended. Just like what Sulu said himself, it was impossible for the hundreds of soldiers below the stage to suddenly repent, have a flash of inspiration, and collectively transform into youths like him. However, there was always a portion of people who would have some sort of feeling. Being a little braver didn't necessarily mean that they wouldn't die, but leaving the despair and sorrow to themselves wouldn't increase the chances of coming back alive. The silence in the auditorium gradually loosened as the sounds of tables and chairs moving, coughing, and whispering voices rang out. The film crew of the Venus Documentary Film Studio of the Department of National Defense was finally allowed to enter the auditorium. Sulu quietly walked out from the side door and stood under the night sky of the West Woods. He lit a cigarette and realized that there were still some words he hadn't said, but there really wasn't much need to say them. The military phone in his hand that had been silent for a long time finally rang again stubbornly. After looking at it for a long time, he finally pressed the button to answer the call. "Have you confirmed the personnel to go?" The prince's calm voice filled with complex emotions came out of the phone. "Yes," Sulu replied. "You know that I don't have any real friends in the Federation other than you. Even Yuzi after she grew up can't be counted as one. Neither can Shiping, but I have to remind you that his identity is different." Sulu held the phone tightly and didn't say a word. Tai Yuan said faintly on the phone, "Speaker Shi An's son and daughter-in-law participated in an interstellar exploration of the Federation. Unfortunately, they were martyred. He's the only male in their family now." "What is identity?" After a long silence, Sulu said, "In the past 3 years, I've always been very proud that I didn't become your subordinate, partner, or anything like that. I've always insisted on being friends with you as equals because I value this term very much. Other than equality, there's also fairness. Including you, the demands made by those big shots in the capital ring are very unfair in my opinion. Every soldier who fights on the front lines has their own story. I'm also the last orphan of the old Sioux family. In my opinion, the only male in the family of the Federation's deputy speaker doesn't have the right to escape, not to mention he's a soldier himself. Fair." Tai Yuan's calm and oppressive voice came from the other side of the phone. "A bunch of old soldiers who have never received any training are being sent to the front line to die just because of the political needs of the Federation government. Do you think this is the fairness that you seek?" 10 days, Sulu corrected. Tai Yuan said coldly, "Is it fair? Shipeng is the nephew of the vice-chairman of the Federation. I suddenly thought of the useless nephew of the Zhong family's tiger." Sulu thought for a moment and said, "He didn't go to the front lines, but you and I both know that about a quarter of the men in the Zhong family in the West Woods died on the battlefield." Without waiting for Tai Yuan to speak, he continued, "You were a soldier in S2, you were injured, you were in danger. I know you're now on the front lines in the West Woods. You're the young master of the Tai family. The Zhong family is the West Woods warlord in the eyes of the politicians in the capital, but you're not like some big shots who hide in the 17th Division to enjoy glory and avoid danger. It's because of the existence of people like you that I don't think that the so-called aristocratic families and the upper class are naturally shameless. If I'm forced to release these old soldiers back to the capital ring, do you think it's fair to the Zhong family? Fair to you? Fair to the normal soldiers who die on the front lines? After hearing Su Li's words, Tai Xuan fell silent on the other side of the phone. After a moment, he said softly, "The Zhong family needs their own sacrifice to obtain military power that they shouldn't have in this democratic society. And I'm only doing this because of my strange nature. Otherwise, I'd be in the capital ring watching the news on TV right now. You have to admit that some people are naturally more important in this world." No. Su Li's answer was simple and clear. There shouldn't be such people in this world. There was silence on the other side of the phone again. Tai Xuan had been worried because of Mr. President's overly aggressive actions this time. As a friend of the knife, he didn't want to speak out because of the pride and reserve of the young master. Now, he was angered by Su Li's stubborn and ungrateful attitude, and his breathing became slightly heavier. After a moment, he said with a hint of mockery and disdain, "Don't forget, when it comes to equality and fairness, if you don't have the background of the Lees of Philadelphia, the appreciation of the president, and the secret help of the big shots in the military, just based on what you did in the foundation building, do you think you can get out of prison and become the youngest lieutenant colonel in the Federation like Madman Lee?" Su Li's hand that was holding the phone tightened. He took a deep breath and said with a hint of undisguised anger, "I've never thought of myself as a great hero who saved the Federation, because when I went to kill Macklin, I didn't know that he was a spy for the Empire. But after all, I was the one who took his life. I was the one who smashed MX. I was the one who slapped Lin Yuanhu's face. And I was the one who was pardoned by the president." He said into the phone, "No matter when, where, or who, if they want to question me with the rank of lieutenant colonel, I'll be as strong as a fucking strong man." After the mockery and angry rebuke, both sides of the phone fell into dead silence at the same time. After meeting in the quiet library for more than 2 years, this was the first time that this pair of young people, who had a huge difference in status, temperament, and ideology, had such a strong conflict under the name of friends. In the distant space of the 3320 planet, Tai Xuan held the phone and looked back at the deep night sky outside the window and the beautiful fireworks that lit up from time to time below. He calmly and attentively tasted Su Li's rare long-winded speech. He was the prince behind the shadow of the Federation. Naturally, he had his own pride and was unwilling to take a step back after the argument. So he kept silent. However, Su Lu on the other side of the phone was also silent. After an unknown amount of time, Tai Xuan laughed self-deprecatingly and gently stroked the hair on his lips with his finger. He remembered that Su Lu did not mention that he had saved his life twice when he was angrily discussing the merits. He understood that this stone stubbornly regarded those as personal friendship and not as righteousness. Thinking of this, his heart softened slightly. He said calmly, "Even Mr. President can't withstand the pressure of a certain class. You are just a small lieutenant colonel. Why do you have to?" "I don't agree with the radical method that the president and the military chose. Even if this method can temporarily quell the protests of the people, it has already caused some kind of division in the upper class. I'm more worried that he will be so radical as to point his spear at us, the few families that are old but still have a lot of power. The Federation and the Empire are at war right now. If there is a deep structural problem, it won't be a good thing." In the military camp, Su Lu also calmed down and said with emotion, "Mr. President is the political ally that your family chose. I don't understand these high and complicated political affairs at all, but, thank you for your concern. But you don't need to worry about how those big shots will deal with me after I return to the capital ring." He raised his head and narrowed his eyes at the starry sky above his head. "This is a battlefield. Countless people are dying every moment. I don't even know if I can survive and return to S1. Since that's the case, why should I be afraid of those old fellows? I should have died in that building S2. In the endless night of the Fox Fortress, I thought that I would die as well. In the military prison of Allure, I thought that there was no way for me to get out alive. But the president, the old man, and those big shots in the military saved me. This life of mine was earned for no reason. It is what I owe the Federation. In truth, I am also afraid of death, but those people from the Empire have to be driven out, right? Tai Yuan said calmly, yes, this is a truth that doesn't need to be discussed. Su Lu held the phone and laughed happily, revealing his white teeth. In the end, we still have a common language. After a long silence, Tai Yuan said with a trace of emotion, sometimes, I feel that the two of us are just 20 years old. We should be in our youth, but we are forced to think about so many complicated things and go through so many difficult choices. It really doesn't feel good. Think about Madman Li. You will realize that our lives aren't that bad. Su Lu leaned against the wall and then said seriously, my team members have been training these new recruits hard. They are already very tired, all for the sake of protecting their lives. I won't deliberately push these young masters into the fire pit, and I won't hide them in the Mecha Fortress. In fact, you and I both know that the mission this time won't be that bad. Tai Yuan smiled and said, you are right. The president and the military only need them to appear on the front lines, not die. After hanging up, he slowly retracted his gaze and lowered his head to think about his only friend in the distance. He thought to himself, where could there be a truly safe mission on the battlefield? A middle-aged man across the long table looked at him with interest and said, you can't convince that rock. In fact, I really want to transfer him to the West Woods to be my personal soldier. This middle-aged man was wearing the standard military uniform of the 4th Military Region, with stars on his shoulders. Although he was sitting casually, he gave off a strong feeling of a tiger's roar. His chiseled facial features were full of a sense of majesty. I can't convince you either. Tai Yuan replied calmly, Mr. President and the big shots of the military all know of your military talent. Now that the war has begun, most of the 70 or so divisions in this star sector are still in the warships, occasionally going to the surface of the planet for a vacation. If this situation continues for a while, I am very worried that it will anger Mr. President. Is this the intention of the Tai family, or is this the suggestion of my confidential secretary? The middle-aged general asked calmly. The latter. Tai Yuan paused for a moment and answered seriously. He controlled all the forces that participated in this war, had the qualifications to anger President Pabre, and dared to make the young master of the Tai family his secretary. In this part of the universe, other than the tiger of the Zhong family who fought against the Empire alone for more than 10 years, who dared to go against him in the West Woods, Su Lu hung up the phone and raised his hand to his forehead as if he wanted to pick the stars in the night sky. At this moment, someone walked over from behind him. Bai Yulan handed over the electronic manual and said softly, the mission has been confirmed. It is indeed the Bureau of Proclamation's mission to reset the electronic monitoring network. The Bureau of Proclamation official in charge of technical guidance will meet us directly on Planet 163. Xiong Linquan, Lu Jiao, and all the members of Group 7 silently walked out of the auditorium and gathered together. Su Lu took out a 37 brand cigarette from his pocket and began to seriously hand out cigarettes to the members around him. Regardless of whether they smoked or not, all the members took the cigarette seriously and put it on his lighter to light it up. Chapter 448. These veterans knew very well that because Su Lu had brought the nation's maiden to Planet 5460, this secret mission for the Bureau of Proclamation was the first time Team 7 had been sent out on a mission in this war. Therefore, they could feel what Su Li's serious distribution of cigarettes meant, it was the smoke from the battlefield steeped in alcohol. Listening to the noises of the rookies in the auditorium behind them, they became even more silent. They lowered their heads and smoked without saying a word, their expressions firm and calm. Team 7 had a total of 21 members. Before they could finish distributing, the dark blue number 37 brand cigarettes had already been distributed. Bai Yulan smiled slightly and took out her own number 37 brand cigarettes from her pocket. She held one in her mouth and gave one to Lan Xiaolong beside her. Su Le held the cigarette in his mouth and opened the map of Planet 163's surface from the electronic manual. Through the somewhat dazzling smoke, he looked at the work area marked in green and narrowed his eyes slightly. If the military's air support could be timely and powerful, reconstructing the glory of the charter in this 3,200 square kilometer area would not be a difficult task. At least, his troops would not have to be like Du Shaoqing's Iron 7th Division, fighting from Yellow Mountain Ridge all the way to the Northern Hemisphere. It was so tragic that it made one's hair stand on end. When can the West Woods Military District send the 3D topographic map over? They should be able to get it when we get on the warship, Bai Yulan replied. The Imperial Expeditionary Force has occupied this planet for more than 40 years. Although they can't heavily guard every area on the planet, we still have to go deep into enemy territory, which is very dangerous. The most troublesome thing is that the Bureau of Proclamation's lowest level of electronic surveillance network setup is a bit complicated even for a professional engineer like me. These guys in the auditorium have only learned it for 10 days. Can they meet the minimum requirements? From the battle mobilization to the argument with his friends, it was rare for him to talk so much tonight, but he still had to continue. He rubbed his somewhat dry throat and asked. Everyone looked at Gu Shifeng at the same time. This young man with delicate features was the electronics technician of Group 7. These few days, the training in the military camp had been arranged by him. Gu Shifeng adjusted her crooked military cap and looked at Su Lo as she replied, reporting to supervisor, I once did a secret mission for the Bureau of Proclamation. The installation of the electronic equipment may seem troublesome, but it can be broken down into a clear isolation process. During the training, I've already divided the recruits into 6 groups for teaching. All they need to do is to repeat some monotonous laying techniques. If the Bureau of Proclamation officials can meet up with us on the planet, there shouldn't be a problem after a few days of intensive training. Su Lo then looked at Xiong Linquan. Xiong Linquan said in a low voice, their physical condition is very bad now. The past 10 days have been too rough, and the acidic substances accumulated in their muscle fibers are too strong. Although they have taken a lot of medicine, they can't digest it in a short time. However, if they can have 5 days of buffer time on the warship, then I can guarantee that when we arrive at Planet 163, these old soldiers will be in their best condition. Bai Yulan softly interjected, right now, the space channel is too dense. Even if it's an emergency military mission, it will take at least 5 days to get to Planet 163 from the main planet. Su Le silently and quickly flipped through the electronic manual. In the end, he raised his head and glanced at Ho Xiandong, the medical officer of Group 7. Ho Xiandong laughed self-deprecatingly and said, the West Woods has used up all of the stimulants, but it won't be difficult to replenish them. Actually, the quality of these old soldiers is a bit beyond my expectations. Probably because their families are too rich, their bodies that look like they've been drained by alcohol and women are actually very healthy. It's just that they look a bit miserable. As for Yan Bingyan and those bodybuilders, they're so healthy that it makes one's hair stand on end. Right, they'll probably be dead drunk tonight, but it shouldn't be a big problem. Su Lo and everyone else laughed. He looked at the haggard and tired faces of his subordinates beside him and knew that they had worked extremely hard these past few days. A faint sense of guilt rose in his heart. If it weren't for his background as a supervisor, the Federation government wouldn't have chosen Group 7 to do this extremely troublesome mission. While feeling guilty, he also felt extremely proud. Looking at these tanned and determined faces, he was very proud that his battle companions were the most professional and unprofessional group of people on the battlefield. Lan Xiaolong took a deep drag on his cigarette, threw it to the ground, and stepped on it to catch his breath. He looked at Su Lo and said with a shrug, "In order to let these young masters survive, we've done everything we can. What happens on the battlefield is something that we can't control. Just do your best, don't be too stressed. I don't feel any pressure. Life and death on the battlefield is the fairest." Su Lo lowered his head and took a deep breath of the slightly hot smoke. He said with a hoarse voice, just like what Master Schiller said in that traveling swordsman's play, "No matter how many eggs are used, each will kick the rice." Lan Xiaolong shrugged and said with disgust, "I hated that play the most, especially after the male lead was kicked by his junior sister. I sulked in my bed for 2 days and 2 nights, feeling so bitter that my whole body felt uncomfortable." Su Lo looked at him and thought of how he felt when he watched that play when he was young. He thought of those sour eyes that belonged to youth and couldn't help but feel like he knew Xiong Lin Quan well. But compared to the life and death of the artillery fire in the West Woods, those sour feelings were actually so young and inexperienced. "Rest early, we're leaving tomorrow." Su Lo patted Xiong Linquan's broad shoulder and said, "Our Group 7 can't live so sullenly on the battlefield." The crowd dispersed and the auditorium fell silent. There were old soldiers who were drunk in life and dreaming of death, members of Group 7 who were sleeping on their pillows, people who were quietly sitting by the window and carefully wiping their knives and bayonets, and people who were under the stars in the sky. Su Lo looked at the dazzling curtain of stars in the night sky and blinked his left eye. He said to the old man in his heart with a smile, "I'm going to plant the seeds for you." Then he saw the word "thank you" with his left eye. There was a shiny cobblestone that was washed by the river and shattered into pieces. It was like the most famous spicy hot pot in the capital special district. It was heartbreaking and painful. Then more stones were shattered into pieces. The yellow sand and black soil in front of the temporary bulletproof pit jumped up and sputtered sorrowfully. It sprayed on people's bodies and covered them with a thin but scorching layer. Shi Peng's fingers pinched hard on the soil mixed with blood in front of him and quickly and helplessly gasped for breath. Through the transparent helmet in front of him, he looked at the dense white lines of bullet marks above his head and listened to the sharp screeching sound. His whole body was completely stiff. Although his body was full of strength, there was no way for him to use his nervous system to command his bones and muscles to make the correct response. A second ago, his comrade beside him was hit by a few bullets from the Empire. Blood spurted into a beautiful straight line. At that moment, Shi Peng turned his head in shock and found that, just like in the movies, his comrade's heavy body was hit by a few high-speed bullets and flew back at a high speed. It was like a bag of flour that was hit by a heavy blow and then began to spray flour. Was this a real battlefield? Shi Peng buried his head in the soil and trembled in fear. His eyes began to gradually disperse. He did not see his comrade holding a Cayenne machine gun and counterattacking with flames, nor did he hear what a veteran was roaring angrily not far away. He could only hear the dense roar of the Empire's guns and cannons. He could only see the churning and sputtering soil in front of him from time to time. He could only see the terrifying and disgusting color of human blood in the soil. After all, he had learned some things from the military camp when he was in that shady 83-84 unit in the Harbor City Garrison Guard District. In the 10 days before he came to this planet, he was tortured by those ruthless mercenaries and was forced to learn even more countermeasures on the battlefield. As the only male in the family of the Deputy Speaker of the Federation, he was without a doubt a real first-rate rich kid. In the prosperous capital ring, in the bizarre world of senses, he had seen blood, drugs, and even death. However, when he came to the front line of the West Woods, he realized that what he had seen before was fake. Between the whistling bullets and the smoke, he was a little absent-minded. He had completely forgotten the tactical manuals that he had learned. He only knew that he was as stiff as a piece of wood and as cowardly as an ostrich under the fortification, not daring to raise his head at all. Wiping the blood on his face with the most careful movements, he looked at half of his finger that was only 10 centimeters away from his lips. Breathing in the scorching air, he suddenly had the urge to vomit. W3 Team, retreat at full speed. A voice sounded in the field infantry communication system. At this moment, on the battlefield that was full of bullets and whistles, this voice was so clear and calm. It was so calm that there was a sense of indifference to life and death. It was like a young lady in a top club in the capital special zone, using an indifferent tone to evaluate the bloody wild beef in front of her. Inside the Silan military camp, Shi Peng and many others were already incomparably familiar with this voice. It was because this voice had once made them roll on piles of shit, blister all over under the scorching sun, and gave them endless humiliation and torment. But at this moment, this voice in their ears was as pleasant as the music that floated from the sky. Yes, W3 Team. In the face of the parallel fire of the Imperium's light armored troops, W3 Team had the best chance of survival by retreating in two flanks. Shi Ping felt that she was awakened from a nightmare by this voice. Her right hand trembled as she pried open the broken finger in front of her and found her gun from the foamy dust. After a few rapid breaths, she suddenly turned around and ran to the back of the camp. The gunshot sounded behind her, louder and clearer than the beating of her heart. With a pale face, Shi Ping ran desperately like a rabbit and crossed a gentle slope behind the simple fortification. With a bang, she fell heavily into the muddy water. The dirty muddy water flowed down from the infantry's helmet and blocked his vision. She desperately wiped the muddy water off her helmet, but she could only vaguely see the smoke around her. She did not know where to go at all. In an instant, a feeling of despair rushed into her chest, making her legs feel like they were filled with lead. She increasingly felt that the gunshots of the Imperium behind her were like countless rapid, life-threatening drumbeats. She stood at the bottom of the gentle slope in a daze. She seemed to hear the sound of the Imperium's armored vehicles around her, and then she heard a whooshing sound. A palm slapped her hard on the cheek, creating a clear and crisp sound through the hard helmet. Shi Peng was heavily knocked to the ground. Almost at the same time, an Imperium's light-guided rocket flew over with a whoosh and burst into flames in front of her. She looked back in shock. Su Lo, whose face was full of smoke and dust, panted and said, "Show us the map and retreat to the red dot." Chapter 449. In order to win the space war with the Federation, for the past 70 years, His Majesty had not hesitated to incite internal strife, squeezing productivity to the extreme, ignoring the 7 long years of interstellar travel, and continuously sending a huge amount of manpower and material resources, millions of Imperial soldiers and hundreds of millions of tons of supplies, to the front line of the West Woods. Despite such great determination and courage, the Imperial Expeditionary Force still could not achieve a decent victory. In the end, they could only hide in 3 planetary systems and linger on with their last breaths. That was because the Federation had the glory of the Charter. With the multi-layer surveillance network everywhere, the Federation could control all the military operations of the Imperial Expeditionary Force. No matter how secretive these operations were, they could not escape the eyes of the glory of the Charter. The central computer underground in the Federation's capital special district had unimaginable calculation, or as it was called, deduction ability. With the help of the central computer, the mobilization of the Federal Army could be achieved to the maximum extent of instantaneous and automatic. It was like a battle between 2 experts. One of them had a black cloth over his eyes, while the other could see all the movements of his opponent clearly. How could such a battle be fought? The Imperial soldiers had launched several desperate and frenzied attacks, but in the end, they were still forced to retreat under the cold glare of the glory of the Charter. Fortunately, during the last war, they had completely destroyed the surveillance network in the two semi-planetary systems of the Federation, so they had a temporary place to rest and recuperate. These two semi-planetary systems were the 3,320 planetary systems, the 163 planetary systems, and half of the 5,460 planetary systems. The war that broke out at the end of the 1960s of the constitutional calendar was a huge military operation named Victory. The strategic goal that had to be achieved was to drive the invaders of the Empire away from the 2.5 planets that they had occupied for decades. In order to achieve this strategic goal, and to reduce the terrifying investment of military resources and the number of deaths of soldiers as much as possible, the first thing that the Federation military authorities had to do was, of course, without a doubt, to reconstruct the heavy surveillance network so that the glory of the Charter could shine through the darkness at the edge of the West Woods again, so that the Imperial Expeditionary Force hiding on the 3 planets would become a black spot that was not new under the sun. There was nowhere to hide and nowhere to run. Since the flames of war ignited on the 5,460 planetary system, the federal military began to speed up the pace of reconstructing the Charter network. Countless highly sensitive self-changing orbit satellites were released into space by warships, and countless miniature electronic positioning devices were scattered in the grasslands, forests, and oceans. However, in the decades of war, millions of Imperial soldiers had died because of the glory of the Charter. The Imperial Expeditionary Force had always been extremely vigilant against the Federation's electronic surveillance network. How could they allow the Federal Army to reconstruct the network right under their noses? It was like countless chains strangling their throats. On the basis of the lack of fleets and long-range missiles, the Imperial armies developed powerful anti-surveillance methods and concealment technologies to counter the highly sensitive satellites. They also mastered the method to find and destroy those miniature electronic positioning devices in an extremely short amount of time. Therefore, the federal military needed to lay out the low-frequency band network on the ground, and this required a large number of ground engineering units to complete. In order to avoid the intensive electronic surveillance of the Imperial armies and avoid the unreasonable and crazy destruction of the newly laid surveillance network by the enemy, the ground engineering units could not even mobilize heavy armored units, let alone eye-catching mechas. Before the Federation's main forces landed on the surface of the planet, there were already many such engineering units that took great risks and quietly snuck in. The 7th Team of the Shell Motor Company was one of the inconspicuous units. The 7th Combat Team was not very lucky. After arriving at Planet 163, they immediately threw themselves into the work of repairing the glory of the Charter. Today was the first time they carried out the task of laying out the surveillance network. Temporarily under the jurisdiction of the 3rd Battle Area Command in the West Woods, they left the temporary air transport transfer point in the morning and spent half a day hurriedly completing the installation of the equipment in the designated area. However, no one would have thought that on the way back, less than 10 kilometers away from the light battleship pickup point, they unluckily encountered an Imperial Expeditionary Force patrol unit. The encounter was a coincidence. Presumably, the Imperial Patrol Unit also did not expect to encounter a group of sneaky Federation people in this beautiful landscape. It was already very unlucky to encounter the enemy on the way back from their first mission. However, the 7th Combat Team was even more unlucky because the Imperial Patrol Unit they encountered was actually a light armored unit. Bullets whizzed past the top of his head. Sulu held a standard precision gun with both hands and leaned his back against the simple fortification above the gentle slope. He lowered his head and did not move. From the corner of his eyes, he saw his subordinates retreating under the cover of the heavy machine guns. His mood was slightly relieved. This was also the first time he had encountered a real battle. In the Yellow Mountain range of Planet 5460, operating a mecha to fight was completely different from just wearing the equipment for individual soldiers. However, for some reason, He narrowed his eyes, listened to the sound of guns and cannons, and smelled the faint burnt smell of gunpowder. He did not feel any sense of panic. It was as if the dangerous battlefield was originally the place that his big heart was most familiar with. He used his left hand to pull a thin rope on the edge of his bulletproof vest. The end of the rope was a video storage device about the size of a fingernail. He gently placed it on the floating soil that was shaken up by the cannonball. Half a second later, the image of the situation below the gentle slope appeared on the small ultra-thin light screen in front of Shancho's helmet. There were 11 Imperial heavy-armored tanks charging toward the position at high speed. The ground trembled slightly with the roar. In the middle of the tank formation, there were hundreds of Imperial Expeditionary Force soldiers carrying cold machines. They silently and suffocatingly began to charge. The Empire's light-armored squad. Su Lu saw this scene and became slightly nervous. He silently cursed a few vulgarities. He subconsciously licked his dry lips and found that the soil on the planet beside his lips was actually a little sweet. He did not know if it was because it was originally like this or because it was stained with the blood of his comrades. Today was the first time Group 7 had ventured into the side of the battlefield, and the installation of low-frequency surveillance equipment went smoothly. Unfortunately, they were too unlucky. When they were retreating, they accidentally ran into the Empire's patrol team. However, this Empire's patrol team was obviously much stronger than the standard patrol team. How could Group 7, lacking heavy weapons and equipment, block the enemy's charge? When they discovered the enemy, Group 7 immediately retreated and set up a simple fortification in the middle of the slope. Behind the slope was a grassland. If the Empire's armored squad were to take advantage of their speed, the fate of the 100 or so soldiers of Group 7 would be in danger. After a few rapid breaths, Su Li's face became a little pale. However, his eyes became brighter and brighter. He suddenly half-squatted and continuously pulled the trigger while facing the gentle slope. Within half a second, half of the bullets in the magazine were fired. The gunfire strung out of the black barrel and made a buzzing sound. It looked like he was shooting aimlessly, but several Imperial soldiers hiding behind the armored vehicles suddenly had several bullet holes in their bodies and fell heavily to the ground. The bullets drew scorching white lines in the sky above their heads. They were extremely dense. The crisp and terrifying gunshots drilled into people's ears. There was a clear feeling of the recoil coming from his fingers. He did not have time to observe the result of the shooting. Su Li's left foot deeply stomped on the ground. With a muffled sound, every piece of dirt was shaken to the point that it was incomparably solid. Meanwhile, his body used this recoil force to strangely turn into a gray line and move 5 meters along the simple fortification. He fell heavily to the ground. Almost at the same time, an Imperial armored vehicle's machine gun roared and began to fire at the patch of dirt he was originally on. A dense rain of bullets came whistling and directly turned that patch of dirt into a swamp. At that moment, if Su Lu had hesitated for a moment, if he was excited by the results of the battle and proud of the shooting ability he had learned from Magnolia, he would probably have become a corpse by now. Even if he was wearing the latest soft ceramic bulletproof vest developed by the Federation, under the bombardment of the Imperial armored vehicle's machine gun, only one of his limbs would have been torn apart. Every pair of muscle fibers was extremely tight. Powerful strength filled every corner of his body. With a pale face and bright eyes, Su Lu dragged the machine with his right hand and moved at an unbelievable speed above the gentle slope. He was like a shadow. The Imperial soldiers below could not determine his position at all. Behind a large rock on the western side of the gentle slope, Su Lu wiped the sweat and dust from his face and curled his body into a ball. A few meaningless bullets on the battlefield had just hit the rock beside him and splashed out a few sparks. He poked the gun in his hand out of the rock and began to fire with all his might. Through the vision of the infantry helmet, he could clearly see that most of the bullets had landed on the armored vehicle. Only one of the Imperial soldiers had a few bloody holes in his thigh. On the gentle slope of the battlefield, countless gun barrels began to emit flames and spit out bullets. The members of Team 7 tried to use this wave of bullets to temporarily suppress the Imperial soldiers' charge. After all, the speed of the armored vehicles when entering the gentle slope was greatly limited. Other than the dozen or so veterans responsible for blocking the attack, there were also some rookies who did not have time to retreat to the grassland. They bravely stood up and began to fire at the Imperial soldiers below. However, their actions were inspired by courage or fear. The effect of their shooting was not good, and it was extremely dangerous. However, this wave of counterattack did not achieve the desired effect. The Imperial soldiers' formation was not messed up at all. Their charging speed was extremely fast, and they completely ignored the fallen comrades around them. It looked like they were about to reach the bottom of the gentle slope. Su-Luk picked up his gun and began to change his shooting location. He found an inconspicuous haystack and narrowed his eyes as he stared at the holographic screen. He asked through the comm system, "When will the air support arrive?" 2 more minutes. Magnolia's calm and quick reply came through the earpiece. 2 minutes seemed like a very short period of time. However, on this gentle slope of the meadow, amidst the rain of bullets, it felt like an eternity. Just as Su-Lu was silently thinking of a way out while shooting, he suddenly heard an explosive roar from the haystack beside him. "Run!" Xiong Linquan stood up majestically from the haystack, shaking up countless strands of grass. With a loud roar, the Darlin autocannon in his thick arms rotated at high speed and shot out 6 beautiful fireworks. Chapter 450. The year of the tiger is coming, and the wind is blowing fiercely. I wish my brothers and sisters that the men are full of vigor and might, and the ladies be fierce tigresses at home. I don't mean to be derogatory, but I wish everyone's whole family good health, and the elders good health, and a long life. Another thing is to apply for leave until the 5th day of the Lunar New Year to resume writing. 2 nights ago, I spent the night in Harbin. I painfully struggled with myself for a long time, wondering whether I should write or not. The leader took out a coin, and I lost the bet. So, with red eyes, I wrote yesterday's chapter. Yesterday evening, I arrived in Yichang, and it went very smoothly. I thanked the relevant authorities for their support for my return home. After that, I drank some wine and felt very good. When I woke up this morning, without any battle, I very seriously decided to apply for leave from everyone. I will resume writing on the 5th day of the Lunar New Year. Because it is the Lunar New Year, I need to visit relatives, drink wine, and have some fun. I have always had a dream. For writers like us, to be able to rest for 2 days a week, and to be able to take the entire year off with pay. We can't skip the Mid-Autumn Festival, National Day, and so on. Marriage and maternity leave are a must. What kind of realm is this? However, that can only be the treatment of a wife. I do want to, but during the Lunar New Year, I need to take a good rest. It just so happens that the recommendations for the past 2 days have been pretty good. I am very sorry to the editor who loves me so much. I bow. Speaking of which, there is a young girl editor in our group called Hai Xing. I haven't seen her yet. Speaking of which, whether it is the Suzaku story or the year of the Qing dynasty, I seem to have been resting for the past 4 or 5 years during the Lunar New Year, right? Ah, this is really something. To be able to tolerate a lazy, leisurely, fat, middle-aged man like me, who pretends to be looking for happiness all the time, but is actually a shameless fat middle-aged man. For so long, you guys are really great. Chapter 451. Darlin's rotary cannon was a purely mechanical retro design. Its 6 large-caliber barrels were semi-automatic, and its weight and ammunition capacity were extremely shocking. Because of its terrifying killing power and the area it covered, it was known as the King of Reapers. Every time it began to roar and spin, countless people would die in front of it. Its power was shocking, and its weight was shocking as well. Even after the highest efficiency of shock absorption, the recoil was still able to shake the earth. Therefore, other than the M-series mecha that used Darlin's rotary cannon as a standard, only all-terrain fighter jets and assault helicopters would use it. Very few ground troops used it. If they couldn't even lift it up with all their might, how could they use it in battle? There were always legends on the battlefield. Sulu had heard rumors before that there were some abnormal people in the Federation's military camp who could carry Darlin's rotary cannon onto the battlefield. Only after seeing Xiong Linquan did he know that these legends were right beside him. But at this moment, seeing Xiong Linquan holding Darlin's rotary cannon and crazily spitting out fireworks for the first time, he couldn't help but feel a little shaken. The muscles in his arms were tight. When he fully displayed his strength, they were even thicker than a woman's thighs. The heavy and cold Darlin's rotary cannon continued to roar. Xiong Linquan's entire body trembled along with it, causing the ground to tremble as well. Amidst the loud and muffled gunshots, Darlin's rotary cannon's bullet shells were exceptionally delicate compared to the gunshots. They densely packed and rained down on Su Li's body. His face burned with pain, but he didn't follow Xiong Linquan's instructions and immediately change his shooting position. Instead, he roared, "You're fucking crazy." Xiong Linquan was currently standing on top of the slope like a god, but he was also the most obvious target. Su Li's muscles tensed up, and he was prepared to jump up and push him down. But from the corner of his eyes, he was shocked to see that the dense rain of bullets from the rotary cannon in this man's hands had temporarily suppressed the firepower of the entire Empire's armored squad. Muffled noises of guns entering and exiting echoed non-stop. The entire haystack fell apart. Countless sharp, high-speed bullets spurted out of the 6 barrels that were rotating at a high speed and shot down from high above, hitting the armored vehicles, the rocks in the meadow, and the bodies of the soldiers of the Imperium heavily. It was like the line of an axe that was extremely sharp and chopped down from the west. Da, 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 da. The rocks were shattered into white powder, and the pond was cut into 2 muddy pieces by the shrapnel. The grass and leaves did not shatter but were directly blown into fine powder. Sparks flew from the Imperium's armored vehicles, and so did the ground. From the haystack to the pond in the distance, there was a terrifying straight line that was so deep that one could see the bones of the planet. In this perfectly straight line, there were more than 10 Imperium soldiers. Their bodies exploded into countless smoke and dust in an instant, followed by blossoms of blood that gushed out. Then, they exploded and collapsed, covering the deep ditch below their bodies with the smell of blood. In the hands of Xiong Linquan's thick arms, the incomparably heavy Darlin rotary autocannon was like an unstoppable axe that could split open the heavens. However, he was still able to valiantly maintain the accuracy of his shots under the immense recoil. This was equivalent to using meticulous brushwork to create a large ink painting of mountains and rivers. How ferocious, almost at the same time that Xiong Linquan shattered the haystack and unleashed his explosive attack, Bai Yulan's calm voice rang out from the battlefield infantry command system. In the short stream by the pond on the east side of the gentle slope, which had remained abnormally silent throughout the battle, there was no way to discover the existence of people at all. With a whoosh, a shoulder-fired rocket carried a trail of smoke as it blasted towards the Imperium's armored vehicle at the furthest edge. Xiong Linquan's Darlin rotary cannons berserk firing in a straight line, instantly suppressing the majority of the Imperium's armored squad's firepower. Those high-speed shrapnel rained down on the armored vehicles like a torrential rain. The crisp sounds of the shrapnel ringing out were actually shocking to the Imperium soldiers within the armored vehicles to the point where they didn't dare to raise their heads, forgetting to counterattack. Only the few armored vehicles at the furthest east were outside of the attack range. They were currently calibrating their cannons at high speed, and this silent rocket that seemed to have come from nowhere was precisely aimed at them. That rocket accurately and fiercely struck the armored vehicle, but the officers within the Imperium's armored vehicle coldly continued with their operations. This was because they firmly believed that if the Federation standard rocket couldn't penetrate the armor and strike the vehicle's engine, then there was no way it could deal fatal damage to themselves. However, what shocked most of the people on and around the gentle slope was that not only did the rocket not destroy this armored vehicle, it didn't even explode. It was like a delicate little knife that was stabbed into the deep fertile plains, nailed into the armored vehicle's outer shell. It was so strangely silent. About 20 meters away from the short stream by the pond, the dust-covered Gu Shifeng narrowed her eyes. Amidst the smoke and dust, she stared at that proud Imperium's armored vehicle. Her fingers quickly jumped and pressed on the electric contact device beside her, as if she was dancing or playing the piano. The electric contact device made a light beep sound. The outer shell of the rocket sizzled. Metal shrapnel flew into the air. One could vaguely make out some type of device that was quickly shaving off the armored vehicle's outer shell like peeling a potato. Immediately afterwards, the rocket's core separated, and the second-level engine at the rear reactivated. With a muffled crack sound, it actually drilled a hole into the Imperium's armored vehicle, and then drilled in. Amidst the hail of bullets and the ear-piercing noise, the quagmire seemed to have become quiet for an instant. A muffled noise sounded. The interior of the Imperium's armored vehicle exploded. It was fiercely shaken off the ground, but after just a short distance, it fell down heavily again. It was like a fragile, dark-colored cardboard box, twisted and deformed by the destructive force within. It was incredibly wretched. Countless strands of light pink smoke poured out from the cracks of this armored vehicle. The Imperium soldier inside should have been completely dead. The previously swaggering vehicle could no longer move, and it died on the spot. At this time, Gu Shifeng had already carefully crawled back under the cover of the hail of bullets from his comrades. His entire body was covered in mud, and he had long blended in with the ground beside the quagmire. Only his fingers were still rapidly operating the area's electric control system. The enemy was too sudden, and the time to set up the defense was too short. He had to use infrared methods to detonate the devices his comrades had hurriedly set up. As he crawled, explosions sounded behind him. A cloud of smoke rose up like a cute mushroom. The handsome man crawled in panic, his fingers moving quickly, detonating the anti-infantry mines that those bastards had irresponsibly thrown behind him one after another. For some reason, there was a happy smile on his face. From time to time, there would be the sound of bullets whistling through the air. From time to time, there would be Federation soldiers poking their heads out from the mud of the simple fortifications, coldly and silently firing accurately. Below them, an Imperium soldier would fall to the ground, dead or heavily injured. The berserk Xiong Linquan, the handsome and ruthless Gu Shifeng, and Magnolia Bai, who had been calmly commanding the battle but had never fired a single shot, hid in the environment to preserve the crisp sounds of gunfire that killed the enemy. Together, they formed the Shell Motor Company's 7th Combat Team. This team, which had almost all of its luster stolen by Supervisor Su Lo, had finally displayed its experienced combat strength in today's battle. With his hand on the ground, Su Lo used his naked eyes to observe the situation around the gentle slope. His palm was a bit uncomfortable from the scalding hot bullet shells, but he couldn't bring himself to smile. The 7th Combat Team's hastily set up anti-infantry mines seemed to be very powerful, but their effective killing power wasn't great. They had indeed suppressed the Imperium soldiers to the ground, but they couldn't truly destroy those armored vehicles. Beside him, Xiong Linquan roared as he fired a torrent of bullets. The bullets hit those armored vehicles, and the shells were horrible to look at. However, because the range of the bullets was gradually expanding, they couldn't cause a decisive destruction. Although the 7th Combat Team displayed powerful combat strength, they still lacked heavy equipment. The Imperium's armored vehicles were getting closer and closer. At the side of the simple fortification and the quagmire on the gentle slope, there were about 30 members of the 7th Combat Team defending. In the grassland behind them, there were still no signs of the Federation's fighter jets. Instead, what was worrying was that the backs of the soldiers who were the first to retreat were still so clear. Could they hold on for 2 minutes? If the Imperium's armored vehicles were allowed to directly charge past the gentle slope and enter the grassland where the armored vehicles could display their high mobility and power, then the 7th Combat Team would be doomed. The density of the bullets around the grassland decreased slightly. Of course, the heavy rotary cannon in Xiong Linquan's hand was still roaring. No one could understand how much ammunition this fierce gunner had brought with him to be able to maintain such suppressive fire for so long. Xiong Linquan, to the right. Su Li's squinted eyes suddenly flashed with a strange light. He noticed that 5 Imperium soldiers were silently taking a long detour to avoid the violent shooting range of Dahlon's rotary cannon. They silently and quickly approached from behind and were attempting to open fire. As the commander of the 7th Combat Team, when faced with an enemy, he did not hesitate to hand over command to Bai Yulan. That was because he had an excellent quality. He knew what he was good at and what he should do. Therefore, when he stood under the rain of bullets, he did not have the intention to stand up and open fire with Dahlon. Even when he noticed that there was movement behind him, he only shouted, "Big Bear." "What, boss?" Xiong Linquan's tanned face was flushed red. The veins on his thick arms bulged, as if they could explode at any time. He had a heavy expression on his face as he painfully maintained the suppressive fire coverage. Even with his physical strength, he was probably reaching his limit. After hearing Su Li's words, he did not even look in that direction. This man ignored the fierce bullets and dust that flitted past him from time to time. He ignored the Imperium's vanguard soldiers that crept over from the side. He continuously pulled on the trigger, his thick lips continuously muttering certain words. "ACW, I want ACW. Fuck, I want ACW. ACW, who can give me an ACW?" Xiong Linquan did not respond. Su Lu learned one thing in that instant: the battlefield only required teamwork and iron-like military discipline. In order to cover the retreat of the recruits and hold on until the Federation's air support arrived, the suppressive fire coverage of Dahlon's rotary cannon in Xiong Linquan's hands was the most crucial part. Even if he died, this man would probably continue to pull on the trigger. His mind worked quickly, but his body's reaction was even faster. With a whoosh, he flashed out from behind Xiong Linquan and stepped on the dirt of the simple fortification. He crouched down and stuck close to the ground as he charged forward at high speed, pouncing towards the Imperium soldiers that crept up from the side. In that instant, he, who was wearing a gray military uniform, was like a leopard moving unhindered through the blazing wilderness. Chapter 452. No one could use their body to block bullets, not even war god Li Pifu. But could that godlike old man dodge bullets? Su Lu, who had charged out of the smoke, didn't have the luxury of time to consider this question. When his military boots broke through the mud and rushed down the slope, he already understood that the so-called dodging bullets was actually avoiding the enemy's gaze, arm, and muzzle. Then, closing the distance at high speed, killing the enemy at close range, or escaping in a hurry, theoretically speaking, a single glance could cover tens of thousands of miles. Adding on the fact that the nerve bundle had less than 1 meter of time to judge, the time it took professional soldiers to aim and fire was so short that it was negligible. Moreover, on the battlefield, there was often no need to aim, such as the 5 Empire soldiers who had made their way to the west side of the meadow. Therefore, even though Su Li's movements were as fast as a jaguar, he still put himself in absolute danger. In this universe, there was no one who wasn't afraid of death. Even the heroic and ruthless madman Li and the majestic godlike Li Pifu wouldn't try to use their own flesh and blood to meet the bullets of the Empire soldiers. However, Su Lu had no choice but to jump. He had no choice but to temporarily disregard his own life and death. The officer of this light-armored squad of the Empire had probably already set his eyes on the west side of the meadow when Team 7 had quickly retreated to set up their defenses at the beginning of the battle. The 5 Empire soldiers who had snuck over had extremely high military attainments. Their movements were too mesmerizing, and their movements were too mesmerizing. As a result, the members of Team 7 who were hiding in the meadow were unable to effectively fire at them. However, these Empire soldiers were about to threaten Xiong Linquan's flank. Something that could make Su Lu disregard his own life and death was naturally more important than his own life and death. For example, the life and death of the members of Team 7 at this moment. In order to kill these 5 Empire soldiers, he had no choice but to charge out and jump down. He charged toward the road ahead that might be bloody and bleak, jumping into the pit where life and death were hard to say. Su Lu! Come back! A voice that could no longer remain calm came from the infantry system. The soldiers of the Federation who were lying behind the meadow saw that their highest commanding officer had actually rushed out of the fortification like a suicide squad member. They couldn't help but feel a chill run down their spines. Bai Yulan, who was in charge of commanding the front, was even more furious and frightened to the extreme. Su Lu could no longer return. After he rushed out of the construction site, he went straight to the western edge of the meadow where the slope was the steepest. Instead of slowing down, he quickly turned his feet and stomped on the soft mossy soil step by step, rushing straight down. In just half a second, his terrifying speed made his body turn into a gray afterimage. Only by overcoming the human's instinctive fear of gravity could one make such a thunderous attack. One had to be fearless. Swoosh, 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 swoosh. The military boots brushed past the floating soil as if they were lightly touching the surface of the water. However, the heavy force transmitted into the ground, shaking out deep footprints and dust. In an instant, Su Lu rushed straight 30 meters like lightning and arrived in front of the 5 soldiers of the Empire. The 5 soldiers of the Empire saw him jump out of the fortification, and the moment he rushed towards them, they opened fire without hesitation. Bullets rained down, but in the end, they were still a bit too slow. This was because they didn't expect that the Federation officer, who was either brave or stupid, could actually rush so fiercely and so quickly. While he was still in midair, the Cayenne light rifle in Su Li's hand had already sprayed out countless sparks. He didn't care about optical precision at all. He just swung his right arm wide, like a big knife chopping down, causing the bullets to fall in an arc within 20 meters in front of him. Amidst the dense sound of bullets falling, the shooting of the soldiers of the Empire was suppressed to the point that it was slightly chaotic. One of the soldiers of the Empire was knocked back with a muffled sound. 7 to 8 bullet holes appeared on the thick bulletproof vest on his body, giving off white smoke. Almost at the same time, Su Lu had already rushed in front of this person. The light gray figure of Su Lu was actually not much slower than the bullets. At close range, the pale-faced Su Lu smashed down with his fist, smashing into this soldier of the Empire whose face was full of fear. He smashed into this soldier's roar of despair, smashed into this soldier's finger that was trying to pull the trigger in desperation, smashed into this soldier's hard brow bone, and smashed into this soldier's hard brow bone, smashed into this soldier's body, and smashed into this soldier's body. With a muffled thud, this soldier of the Empire instantly collapsed on the wet ground like a piece of wood. He didn't even twitch. The moment the first soldier of the Empire collapsed, Su Li's narrowed eyes, which were as bright as jade but tinged with a hint of blood red. The Cayenne light rifle in his right hand swept horizontally, spraying out all the remaining bullets. Puff, 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 puff. Bullets flew across the swamp below the meadow. It was unknown whether this hail of bullets had hit the remaining 4 soldiers of the Empire. However, Sulu didn't consider this. His body under the dark military uniform was constantly trembling, and his speed was unfathomable like a shadow. He killed his way to the nearest soldier of the Empire. The Cayenne, which was already out of bullets, let out a crisp sound and knocked away the soldier's gun. The 10 postures that he had painstakingly practiced since he was young turned into an animal's instinct at this moment. He attacked like lightning, and the triangular handle of the Cayenne light rifle fiercely pierced this soldier's throat. Su Li's legs trembled, and the military pants around his thighs were torn apart at a speed visible to the naked eye. He swept to the other side, and his left hand shot out like a super-strong hydraulic spring arm, supporting the back elbow of the 3rd soldier of the Empire. Ta, 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 ta. The bullets fired by this soldier's machine brushed past Su Li's cheek, and the gunfire soared into the sky above the meadow. The pale-faced Su Li got close to the other's body, and his knee struck the other's weak lower abdomen. Amidst the cracking sounds, there was no telling how many of the soldier's bones were shattered. He slid to the ground like a broken puppet, but Su Li grabbed his collar and helped him block a few bullets that were shot from the side. Su Li's left hand took out the V-12 pistol from his waist, and with a bang, shot a bloody hole between the 3rd soldier's eyebrows. At the same time, he let out a muffled groan, rolled on the ground, and entangled the 4th soldier like a wisp of smoke, and struck him with his elbow. With another bang, this soldier's head and neck were strangely and terrifyingly twisted. His unfocused eyes carried a trace of fear and disbelief, and he died just like that. Charging down the meadow, he smashed one person to death with his fist, cut another person's throat with his machine gun horizontally, shot another person between the eyebrows with his pistol, and killed another person with a back elbow strike. All of this happened in a short second. The crossfire on the meadow continued, and Su Li had already killed 4 people. His face was mixed with mud and the enemy's blood, and his body was a bit cold. Like a wisp of smoke, like a leopard, he had already pushed his speed to the limit. The bulletproof vest on his body had also suffered several dangerous bullets, but at this moment, for the first time, he felt the cold and the approach of death. Because he saw the black hole of a gun and the shocked and murderous face of a soldier from the Empire. The last soldier of the Empire, under such a ridiculous and terrifying battlefield situation, still maintained an absolutely clear head, displaying the valiant military discipline of the Empire. From the moment Su Li killed his first comrade, he began to pull away from the periphery. At this moment, there was already a distance of 10 meters between Su Li and the last soldier of the Empire. This was a fatal distance of 10 meters. Su Li had previously pounced down like a god, but after all, he was not a real god. He was just a mortal with some strange power. At this moment, he was not exhausted, and when he wanted to jump up and kill the last person, he could not compete with the speed of the bullet that was about to be shot from the muzzle of the enemy. The word "give up" was not in Su Li's life creed. His face instantly became paler, and his eyes became brighter. His body bounced up from the ground, and with a whoosh, he pounced over. However, in such a short time, he could still clearly see that the finger of the enemy that was holding the trigger was slightly white. Was it because the enemy had already begun to use force? When facing death, many people would think of many things, such as the beautiful childhood, the green grass by the river, the first woman they fell in love with, the first warm bed they slept on, the first money they earned. At this moment, Su Li was just a little absent-minded, a little regretful that he did not have time to look back at his history. His history was indeed quite exciting. The crisp sound of the gunshot was so clear amidst the dense gunfire. His body suddenly shook and fell to the ground. However, what shocked him was that the fatal shot of the Empire's soldier did not hit his face, which was not protected by a single soldier's helmet. Instead, it hit his body. The reason was very simple. The moment the Empire's soldier pulled the trigger, 2 bullets were shot from a distance and entered his head one after another. This person was so focused on distancing himself from Su Lo that he did not notice that his body was finally exposed to the muzzle of the Federation soldier's gun. The Empire's soldier fell to the side of the pond with a loud crash. Blood gushed out from his throat and between his eyebrows. His body twitched slightly, and then he could no longer move. On the meadow, Magnolia's face was pale as he looked away from the 21-26 long sniper rifle. This was the first time he had made a move on the battlefield today, and he had demonstrated the comprehensive qualities of an excellent sniper. The title of Magnolia was indeed well-deserved for him. The battlefield above and below the meadow seemed to be silent for a few tenths of a second. The slightly lower frequency of the whistling of the bullets and the shout seemed to have been blown away by the wind on this planet. Not a trace of it could be found anymore. This was a psychological feeling. Group 7 and the Empire's light armored squad were both shocked by this scene. Both sides were controlled by a feeling called inconceivable. The 5 Empire soldiers who were hiding on the west side of the meadow were all killed in a short encounter. All of this happened too fast. It was so fast that those people died tragically with their eyes wide open. It was so fast that the Empire's troops could not react in time. It was so fast that the members of Group 7 in the fortification had only time to be shocked but not enough time to provide support. It was so fast that Lan Xiaolong, who was about to rush out to rescue people, was shocked to find that this bloody and sharp battle drama had simply ended in a flash when his right foot stepped on the soil of the fortification. The dazzling and chaotic battle scene that flashed by at high speed was not enough for the highly nervous people on the battlefield to understand all the details that had happened. Only the 5 corpses of the Empire's vanguard soldiers that were lying haphazardly on the ground were still stubbornly repeating and confirming this shocking story. The people on and off the meadow looked at Su Lo by the pond. They were shocked speechless by the terrifying strength he had just displayed. The man in the smoke, if he was not a monster, then he was a god that had come to the mortal world. Chapter 453. 27 seconds. Magnolia's cold and quiet voice rang out in the infantry system. His breathing was not rushed, nor did he feel any excitement. It was as if he had not fired a shot just now. In the most dangerous moment, from a distance of over 100 meters, the 2 shots were so accurate that they killed the enemy in an instant. This voice rang out in the headphones of the 7 teams, both old and new. This meant how long it would take for the Federation's air support to arrive. Time could not really be frozen. The silence of a few tenths of a second was just a psychological illusion. Following this voice, all the silence and shock were shattered. The whistling of bullets rang out again, and miserable cries rang out again. The quagmire was still the quagmire, and the meadow was still the meadow. This was still a battlefield where people could die at any moment. The military officer of the Empire on the armored vehicle looked at the surveillance footage on the screen, his face ashen. His tone was unyielding and angry as he issued orders in the command system. The 5 dead soldiers of the Empire were his personal guards. The original plan was to sneak over and get rid of the burly man from the Federation who was carrying the Darren rotary cannon. In the end, no one expected that they would die just like that. The Imperial officer's angry voice directly rang out of the armored vehicle and into the ears of the 7 teams above the meadow. However, many people, including Su Lo, did not understand the Imperial language. They could only feel the anger of the Imperial people. Moreover, they could also see the 3 Imperial armored vehicles, under the dense rain of bullets and anti-infantry smoke, forcefully turned to the west side of the meadow. It seemed that the Imperial people, in their madness, were prepared to use 1/3 of their powerful firepower to overturn the thin western defensive line that only had Xiong Linquan and Su Lo. Hearing the heavy metal components and the sound of tracks tearing the ground, Su Lo, who had just escaped with his life, immediately became even paler. "Boss, run!" Xiong Linquan's panicked roar came from the meadow behind him. The Darren rotary autocannon in the hands of this burly man had already used up all of its bullets. His determination to retreat was not any weaker than his previous bravery. Looking down at the Empire's armored vehicles that were turning around to shoot, he shamelessly and resolutely transformed into a streak of gray light. He completely ignored Su Lo, who was in front of the camp, and madly ran away like a bolt of lightning towards the distance. A chill rushed into Su Li's mind from the back of his waist, like thousands of needles pricking his scalp. After a moment of shock, he sprinted towards the meadow. Multiple explosions rang out in front of and behind him, and the boiling soil was tossed into the air. Panting heavily, Su Li subconsciously made tactical evasive movements, evading the crazy firepower of the Empire's soldiers behind him. Looking at Xiong Linquan fleeing like a fat rabbit, he could not bring himself to laugh at all. He could only think that this bastard actually dared to run before him. The high-speed bullets whizzed past behind him, and the soft ceramic bulletproof vest on his body had countless wounds. Su Li felt as if all the bones in his body had been broken, but he couldn't help but thank God for giving him the strong vitality and luck of a crustacean. Even with so many bullets, not a single one had hit his head. Flipping over the meadow, he ran to his heart's content. In just an instant, he had caught up to Xiong Linquan, who was already in an extremely sorry state. Xiong Linquan had used the Darlin rotary cannon to suppress the Empire's firepower for dozens of seconds. His entire physical strength had long been exhausted, but for some reason, even in the face of the fierce pursuit of the Empire's firepower, he was still unwilling to throw away the incomparably heavy gun in his hands. Su Li could vaguely understand what De Xiong was thinking. Wiping the dirt off his face, he coughed and shouted, "Give it to me." Xiong Linquan did not react. Su Li snatched the heavy Darlin rotary cannon and continued to run out of the smoke, but the footprints he left behind were even deeper than before. 19 seconds. Magnolia's voice sounded in his earpiece again. Amidst the artillery fire that filled the sky, Su Li's left hand held the heavy machine gun, and his right hand had already grabbed the exhausted Xiong Linquan's neck. Every pair of muscle fibers in his body were grinding and squeezing to the most unbearable point. From time to time, the dirt around him would be lifted up, and bullets would sink into the ground. But for some reason, he could not hear the roars and gunfire of the Empire's people. He could only hear his own increasingly heavy breathing and footsteps. 10, 9, he never knew that running could be such a painful thing, especially when every step could lead to death. This kind of torture really made people feel endless fear and despair. 7, 6, how long would it take for the air support to arrive? Would he and the people in Group 7 be able to hold on until that moment? Why did dozens of seconds, even dozens of seconds, seem so slow? Why was Magnolia still able to be so calm at this time and count down so softly like it was the New Year's Eve? An Empire Standard wolf-tongue bullet shot into the ground 10 meters behind Su Li and then exploded 10 meters away. The ground shook violently, and the powerful force threw Su Li's body into the sky. The sky was not quiet either. There was a rain of bullets and smoke. Su Li squinted his eyes and looked over. Finally, he saw more than 10 Federation fighter jets flying over at high speed. In the face of the Federation's reinforcements that had the absolute advantage in air power, the Empire's light armored formation had no way of resisting, and there was no way for them to hold on until their own reinforcements arrived. The fearless Imperial Expeditionary Force soldiers launched their last desperate charge after more than 10 armored vehicles were all turned into mushrooms in the flames. Then, they became corpses on the meadow. Group 7's combat members that were responsible for the rear met up with the members that retreated 6 kilometers behind the meadow. Under the protection of the Federation's fighter jets, they boarded the light battleship. The entire team did not enter the space base to rest. Instead, they moved to the ground base in the evening. The faint red light from the horizon slanted over, adding a bit of warmth. However, when it was rushed by the steel mechas in the twilight, the warmth was instantly mixed with the smell of blood. The diamond-shaped base was located in the southeast deep land of Planet 163. Many temporary barracks were built with high-strength plastic inside the huge base. The barracks near the northern latitude were divided into living and medical areas. At this time, the whole place was filled with the pungent smell of medicine. The low humming of the negative pressure treatment cabin mixed with the screams coming from behind the curtain, making the faces of the people around a little gloomy or ugly. Those wrinkled facial features seemed to be stuck with medical glue, and it was difficult to stretch out. A medical officer with a captain's epaulette walked out of the temporary operating room. He rubbed his red and sunken eyes and was about to light a cigarette to reward his tired body. The medical team he led had continuously performed more than 20 operations, both big and small. It was really very tiring. A cigarette was handed over. The medical officer raised his head in shock and saw a man standing in front of him. This man exuded a gentle and quiet aura from head to toe, but also contained a hint of coldness. What made him even more confused was that this person was not wearing a military uniform. "Thank you." The medical officer moved closer to the lighter of the other party and lit the cigarette. He took a deep breath. Bayulan smiled slightly and said, "I should be the one thanking you." He was originally a quiet, calm, and ruthless soldier. Whether it was in front of his former commanding officer or the manager of his company, he had never been so pleasant. However, as a veteran, he knew very well what it meant to be a medical officer on the battlefield. In a sense, the life and death of every soldier was in the hands of these comrades. Group 7 had their own medical officer, Monkey. Many of the veteran members, including Bayulan, were also proficient in battlefield first aid. However, if they really wanted to treat serious injuries, they really needed these medical officers. Moreover, looking at the tired expression of this medical officer, it was obvious how hard it was for them. Bayulan's thank you was very sincere. "The troop on the meadow today was yours." The medical officer held the cigarette in his mouth and looked at Bayulan with interest. He said, "You guys are really unlucky. The military district scattered more than 30 teams on 163 to carry out the mission of the Bureau of Proclamation. Your team has the largest number of people, but your luck is so bad that you encountered the light armored formation of the Imperial people. It's not my team, it's my boss team. It's the guy you just treated." Bayulan explained in a soft voice, and then said with a bitter smile, "This is our first mission, and we are so unlucky. I can't explain it." The medical officer took the cigarette and patted Bayulan's shoulder casually. The blood on his thin gloves naturally stained them. He said, "Don't worry about these guys. Your bad luck ends on the battlefield. In such a terrible battle, no one died. However, there may be a few who need to be amputated." Whether it was the blood on his shoulder or the good or bad news, Bayulan didn't frown. He just nodded. The medical officer admired his reaction. After a moment of silence, he sighed and said, "With your equipment, it's not easy to hold off the Imperial people for so long. I heard that even the commanding officer of the base was shocked and cursed for a long time. Speaking of which team are you from?" "Whitewater Team 7, Bayulan answered concisely. "Whitewater people only smoke blue box 37. I always thought you guys were rich." The medical officer looked at the filter of the cigarette and said with a smile. Suddenly, his expression changed slightly. He looked at Bayulan and said, "Whitewater Team 7. Weren't you disbanded? I remember, you guys regrouped. So you guys are the legendary Team 7. No wonder you are so fierce. The medical officer slapped his head and said in shock, so, the guy lying on the operating table with small eyes, is that guy? Bai Yulan nodded. The medical officer's eyes lit up. He threw away the cigarette butt and walked behind the curtain. What's wrong? Bai Yulan was shocked. The medical officer said embarrassedly, bluegrass anesthesia is too expensive, and we don't have enough of it. So, I didn't use it before. He's probably in a lot of pain. I'm going to give him a shot and let him sleep. Ask him to give me an autograph while I'm at it. The medical officer said excitedly, I'm going to say that I saved Jian Shui's boyfriend. How proud would that be? You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.